Today, in Audiobooks for Me, we are going to listen to Adventure by Jack London. This book is divided in 3 videos. This is Part 3. We hope you enjoy it. Chapter 19, The Lost Toy. Well, Jones said with a sigh, I've shown you hustling American methods that succeed and get somewhere, and here you are, beginning your muddling again. 5 days had passed, and she and Sheldon were standing on the veranda, watching the Martha close-hauled on the wind, laying a tack offshore. During those 5 days, Joan had never once broached the desire of her heart. Though Sheldon, in this particular instance, reading her like a book, had watched her lead up to the question a score of times in the hope that he would himself suggest her taking charge of the Martha. She had wanted him to say the word, and she had steeled herself not to say it herself. The matter of finding a skipper had been a hard one. She was jealous of the Martha, and no suggested man had satisfied her. Olson, she had demanded. He does very well on the Flibberty, with me and my men to overhaul her whenever she's ready to fall to pieces through his slackness. But skipper of the Martha? Impossible. Munster? Yes, he's the only man I know in the Solomons I'd care to see in charge. And yet there's his record. He lost the Umbawa, 140 drowned. He was first officer on the bridge. Deliberate disobedience to instructions. No wonder they broke him. Christian Young has never had any experience with large boats. Besides, we can't afford to pay him what he's clearing on the Minerva. Sparrowhawk is a good man to take orders. He has no initiative. He's an able sailor, but he can't command. I tell you, I was nervous all the time he had charge of the Flibberty at Punga Punga when I had to stay by the Martha. And so it had gone. No name proposed was satisfactory, and moreover, Sheldon had been surprised by the accuracy of her judgments. A dozen times she almost drove him to the statement that from the showing she made of Solomon Island sailors, she was the only person fitted to command the Martha. But each time he restrained himself, while her pride prevented her from making the suggestion. Good whaleboat sailors do not necessarily make good schooner handlers, she replied to one of his arguments. Besides, the captain of a boat like the Martha must have a large mind, see things in a large way. He must have capacity and enterprise. But with your Tahitians on board, Sheldon had begun another argument. There won't be any Tahitians on board, she had returned promptly. My men stay with me. I never know when I may need them. When I sail, they sail. When I remain ashore, they remain ashore. I'll find plenty for them to do right here on the plantation. You've seen them clearing bush, each of them worth half a dozen of your cannibals. So it was that Joan stood beside Sheldon and sighed as she watched the Martha beating out to sea. Old Kinross, brought over from Savo, in command. Kinross is an old fossil, she said, with a touch of bitterness in her voice. Oh, he'll never wreck her through rashness, rest assured of that. But he's timid to childishness, and timid skippers lose just as many vessels as rash ones. Someday, Kinross will lose the Martha, because there'll be only one chance, and he'll be afraid to take it. I know his sort. Afraid to take advantage of a proper breeze of wind that will fetch him in 20 hours, he'll get caught out in the calm that follows and spend a whole week in getting in. The Martha will make money with him, there's no doubt of it, but she won't make near the money that she would under a competent master. She paused, and with heightened color and sparkling eyes, gazed seaward at the schooner. My, but she is a witch. Look at her eating up the water, and there's no wind to speak of. She's not got ordinary white metal either. It's man-of-war copper, every inch of it. I had them polish it with coconut husks when she was careened at Punga Punga. She was a seal hunter before this gold expedition got her, and seal hunters had to sail. They've run away from second-class Russian cruisers more than once up there off Siberia. Honestly, if I'd dreamed of the chance waiting for me at Guvutu when I bought her for less than $300, I'd never have gone partners with you, and in that case, I'd be sailing her right now. The justice of her contention came abruptly home to Sheldon. What she had done, she would have done just the same if she had not been his partner, and in the saving of the Martha, he had played no part. Single-handed, unadvised, in the teeth of the laughter of Guvutu and of the competition of men like Morgan and Raff, she had gone into the adventure and brought it through to success. You make me feel like a big man who has robbed a small child of a lolly, he said, with sudden contrition, and the small child is crying for it. She looked at him, and he noted that her lip was slightly trembling and that her eyes were moist. It was the boy all over, he thought. The boy crying for the wee bit boat with which to play, and yet it was a woman too. What a maze of contradiction she was. And he wondered, had she been all woman and no boy, if he would have loved her in just the same way. Then it rushed in upon his consciousness that he really loved her for what she was, for all the boy in her and all the rest of her, for the total of her that would have been a different total in direct proportion to any differing of the parts of her. But the small child won't cry any more for it, she was saying. This is the last sob. Someday, if Kinross doesn't lose her, you'll turn her over to your partner, I know, and I won't nag you any more. Only I do hope you know how I feel. It isn't as if I'd merely bought the Martha or merely built her. I saved her. I took her off the reef. I saved her from the grave of the sea when 55 pounds was considered a big risk. She is mine, peculiarly mine. Without me, she wouldn't exist. That big nor'wester would have finished her the first 3 hours it blew, and then I've sailed her too, and she is a witch, a perfect witch. Why, do you know, she'll steer by the wind with half a spoke, give and take, and going about. Well, you don't have to baby her, starting head sheets, flattening mainsail, and gentling her with the wheel. Put your wheel down, and around she comes, like a colt with the bit in its teeth, and you can back her like a steamer. I did it at Langa Langa, between that shoal patch and the shore reef. It was wonderful. But you don't love boats like I do, and I know you think I'm making a fool of myself. But someday I'm going to sail the Martha again. I know it. I know it. In reply, and quite without premeditation, his hand went out to hers, covering it as it lay on the railing. But he knew, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that it was the boy that returned the pressure he gave, the boy sorrowing over the lost toy. The thought chilled him. Never had he been actually nearer to her, and never had she been more convincingly remote. She was certainly not acutely aware that his hand was touching hers. In her grief at the departure of the Martha, it was to her anybody's hand, at the best, a friend's hand. He withdrew his hand and walked perturbedly away. Why hasn't he got that big fisherman's staysail on her? She demanded irritably. It would make the old girl just walk along in this breeze. I know the sort old Kinross is. He's the skipper that lies 3 days under double-reefed topsails waiting for a gale that doesn't come. Safe? Oh, yes. He's safe. Dangerously safe. Sheldon retraced his steps. Never mind, he said. You can go sailing on the Martha any time you please, recruiting on Melita if you want to. It was a great concession he was making, and he felt that he did it against his better judgment. Her reception of it was a surprise to him. With old Kinross in command? She queried. No, thank you. He'd drive me to suicide. I couldn't stand his handling of her. It would give me nervous prostration. I'll never step on the Martha again unless it is to take charge of her. I'm a sailor, like my father, and he could never bear to see a vessel mishandled. Did you see the way Kinross got underway? It was disgraceful. And the noise he made about it. Old Noah did better with the ark. But we managed to get somewhere just the same. He smiled. So did Noah. That was the main thing. For an antediluvian. She took another lingering look at the Martha, then turned to Sheldon. You are a slovenly lot down here when it comes to boats. Most of you are, anyway. Christian Young is all right, though. Munster has a slapdash style about him, and they do say old Nielsen was a crackerjack. But with the rest I've seen, there's no dash, no go, no cleverness, no real sailor's pride. It's all humdrum and podgy and slow going, any going so long as you get there heaven knows when. But someday I'll show you how the Martha should be handled. I'll break out anchor and get underway in a speed and style that will make your head hum, and I'll bring her alongside the wharf at Guvutu without dropping anchor and running a line. She came to a breathless pause, and then broke into laughter, directed, he could see, against herself. Old Kinross is setting that fisherman's staysail, he remarked quietly. No, she cried incredulously, swiftly looking, then running for the telescope. She regarded the maneuver steadily through the glass, and Sheldon, watching her face, could see that the skipper was not making a success of it. She finally lowered the glass with a groan. He's made a mess of it, she said, and now he's trying it over again. And a man like that is put in charge of a ferry like the Martha. Well, it's a good argument against marriage, that's all. No, I won't look any more. Come on in and play a steady conservative game of billiards with me, and after that, I'm going to saddle up and go after pigeons. Will you come along? An hour later, just as they were riding out of the compound, Joan turned in the saddle for a last look at the Martha, a distant speck, well over toward the Florida coast. Won't Tudor be surprised when he finds we own the Martha? She laughed. Think of it. If he doesn't strike pay dirt, he'll have to buy a steamer passage to get away from the Solomons. Still laughing gaily, she rode through the gate. But suddenly, her laughter broke flatly, and she reined in the mare. Sheldon glanced at her sharply and noted her face mottling even as he looked, and turning orange and green. It's the fever, she said. I'll have to turn back. By the time they were in the compound, she was shivering and shaking, and he had to help her from her horse. Funny, isn't it, she said, with chattering teeth. Like seasickness, not serious, but horribly miserable while it lasts. I'm going to bed. Send Noah and Viaburi to me. Tell Ornfiri to make hot water. I'll be out of my head in 15 minutes, but I'll be all right by evening. Short and sharp is the way it takes me. Too bad to lose the shooting. Thank you, I'm all right. Sheldon obeyed her instructions, rushed hot water bottles along to her, and then sat on the veranda, vainly trying to interest himself in a 2-month-old file of Sydney newspapers. He kept glancing up and across the compound to the grass house. Yes, he decided, the contention of every white man in the islands was right. The Solomons was no place for a woman. He clapped his hands, and Lalapiru came running. Here you, he ordered. Go along barracks, bring 'em Blackfella Mary, plenty too much, all together. A few minutes later, the dozen black women of Barande were ranged before him. He looked them over critically, finally selecting one that was young, comely as such creatures went, and whose body bore no signs of skin disease. What name you? He demanded. Sangui. Me Mahua, was the answer. All right, you fella Mahua, you finish cook along boys, You stop along White Mary, all the time you stop along. You savvy? Me savvy, she grunted, and obeyed his gesture to go to the grass house immediately. What name? He asked Viaburi, who had just come out of the grass house. Big fella sick, was the answer. White fella Mary talk 'em too much alley time. Alley time talk, and big fella schooner. Sheldon nodded. He understood. It was the loss of the Martha that had brought on the fever. The fever would have come sooner or later, he knew, but her disappointment had precipitated it. He lighted a cigarette, and in the curling smoke of it, caught visions of his English mother, and wondered if she would understand how her son could love a woman who cried because she could not be skipper of a schooner in the Cannibal Isles. Chapter 20. A Man Talk. The most patient man in the world is prone to impatience in love, and Sheldon was in love. He called himself an ass a score of times a day, and strove to contain himself by directing his mind in other channels. But more than a score of times each day, his thoughts roved back and dwelt on Joan. It was a pretty problem she presented, and he was continually debating with himself as to what was the best way to approach her. He was not an adept at love-making. He had had but one experience, in the gentle art in which he had been more wooed than wooing, and the affair had profited him little. This was another affair, and he assured himself continually that it was a uniquely different and difficult affair. Not only was here a woman who was not bent on finding a husband, but it was a woman who wasn't a woman at all, who was genuinely appalled by the thought of a husband, who joyed in boys' games and sentimentalized over such things as adventure, who was healthy and normal and wholesome, and who was so immature that a husband stood for nothing more than an encumbrance in her cherished scheme of existence. But how to approach her? He divined the fanatical love of freedom in her, the deep-seated antipathy for restraint of any sort. No man could ever put his arm around her and win her. She would flutter away like a frightened bird. Approach by contact. That, he realized, was the one thing he must never do. His hand clasp must be what it had always been, the hand clasp of hearty friendship and nothing more. Never by action must he advertise his feeling for her. Remained speech. But what speech appealed to her love? But she did not love him. Appealed to her brain, but it was apparently a boy's brain. All the deliciousness and fineness of a finely bred woman was hers, but for all he could discern, her mental processes were sexless and boyish. And yet speech it must be, for a beginning had to be made somewhere, sometime. Her mind must be made accustomed to the idea. Her thoughts turned upon the matter of marriage. And so he rode overseeing about the plantation, with tightly drawn and puckered brows, puzzling over the problem, and steeling himself to the first attempt. A dozen ways he planned an intricate leading up to the first breaking of the ice, and each time some link in the chain snapped and the talk went off on unexpected and irrelevant lines. And then one morning, quite fortuitously, the opportunity came. My dearest wish is the success of Barande, Joan had just said, apropos of a discussion about the cheapening of freights on copra to market. Do you mind if I tell you the dearest wish of my heart? He promptly returned. I long for it. I dream about it. It is my dearest desire. He paused and looked at her with intent significance, but it was plain to him that she thought there was nothing more at issue than mutual confidences about things in general. Yes, go ahead, she said, a trifle impatient at his delay. I love to think of the success of Baranda, he said, but that is secondary. It is subordinate to the dearest wish, which is that someday you will share Baranda with me in a completer way than that of mere business partnership. It is for you someday, when you are ready, to be my wife. She started back from him as if she had been stung. Her face went white on the instant, not from maidenly embarrassment, but from the anger which he could see flaming in her eyes. "This taking for granted, this when I am ready," she cried passionately. Then her voice swiftly became cold and steady, and she talked in the way he imagined she must have talked business with Morgan and Raff at Gavutu. "Listen to me, Mr. Sheldon. I like you very well, though you are slow and a muddler. But I want you to understand, once and for all, that I did not come to the Solomons to get married. That is an affliction I could have accumulated at home, without sailing 10,000 miles after it. I have my own way to make in the world, and I came to the Solomons to do it. Getting married is not making my way in the world. It may do for some women, but not for me, thank you. When I sit down to talk over the freight on Copra, I don't care to have proposals of marriage sandwiched in. Besides, her voice broke for the moment, and when she went on, there was a note of appeal in it that well-nigh convicted him to himself of being a brute. "Don't you see? It spoils everything. It makes the whole situation impossible. And I so loved our partnership and was proud of it. Don't you see? I can't go on being your partner if you make love to me. And I was so happy." Tears of disappointment were in her eyes, and she caught a swift sob in her throat. "I warned you," he said gravely. "Such unusual situations between men and women cannot endure. I told you so at the beginning. Oh yes, it is quite clear to me what you did." She was angry again, and the feminine appeal had disappeared. "You were very discreet in your warning. You took good care to warn me against every other man in the Solomons except yourself." It was a blow in the face to Sheldon. He smarted with the truth of it, and at the same time, he smarted with what he was convinced was the injustice of it. A gleam of triumph that flickered in her eye because of the hit she had made decided him. "It is not so one-sided as you seem to think it is," he began. "I was doing very nicely on Barandi before you came. At least I was not suffering indignities, such as being accused of cowardly conduct, as you have just accused me. Remember, please remember, I did not invite you to Barandi, nor did I invite you to stay on at Barandi. It was by staying that you brought about this, to you, unpleasant situation. By staying, you made yourself a temptation, and now you would blame me for it. I did not want you to stay. I wasn't in love with you then. I wanted you to go to Sydney, to go back to Hawaii, but you insisted on staying. You virtually—" He paused for a softer word than the one that had risen to his lips, and she took it away from him. "Forced myself on you. That's what you meant to say," she cried, the flags of battle painting her cheeks. "Go ahead. Don't mind my feelings." "All right, I won't," he said decisively, realizing that the discussion was in danger of becoming a vituperative schoolboy argument. "You have insisted on being considered as a man. Consistency would demand that you talk like a man, and like a man listen to man talk, and listen you shall. It is not your fault that this unpleasantness has arisen. I do not blame you for anything. Remember that. And for the same reason, you should not blame me for anything." He noticed her bosom heaving as she sat with clenched hands, and it was all he could do to conquer the desire to flash his arms out and around her instead of going on with his coolly planned campaign. As it was, he nearly told her that she was a most adorable boy, but he checked all such wayward fancies and held himself rigidly down to his disquisition. "You can't help being yourself. You can't help being a very desirable creature, so far as I am concerned. You have made me want you. You didn't intend to. You didn't try to. You were so made, that is all. And I was so made that I was ripe to want you. But I can't help being myself. I can't, by an effort of will, cease from wanting you, any more than you, by an effort of will, can make yourself undesirable to me. Oh, this desire, this want, want, she broke in rebelliously. I am not quite a fool. I understand some things, and the whole thing is so foolish and absurd and uncomfortable. I wish I could get away from it. I really think it would be a good idea for me to marry Noah Noah, or Adamu Adam, or Lala Peru there, or any black boy. Then I could give him orders and keep him penned away from me. And men like you would leave me alone and not talk marriage, and I want. Sheldon laughed in spite of himself, and far from any genuine impulse to laugh. You are positively soulless, he said savagely, because I've a soul that doesn't yearn for a man for master. She took up the gauge. Very well then, I am soulless, and what are you going to do about it? I'm going to ask you why you look like a woman. Why have you the form of a woman, the lips of a woman, the wonderful hair of a woman? And I am going to answer, because you are a woman, though the woman in you is asleep, and that someday the woman will wake up. Heaven forbid, she cried, in such sudden and genuine dismay as to make him laugh and to bring a smile to her own lips against herself. I've got some more to say to you, Sheldon pursued. I did try to protect you from every other man in the Solomons, and from yourself as well. As for me, I didn't dream that danger lay in that quarter, so I failed to protect you from myself. I failed to protect you at all. You went your own willful way, just as though I didn't exist, wrecking schooners, recruiting on Maleta, and sailing schooners. One lone, unprotected girl, in the company of some of the worst scoundrels in the Solomons. Fowler, and Brahms, and Curtis, and such is the perverseness of human nature. I am frank, you see. I love you for that too. I love you for all of you, just as you are. She made a moue of distaste and raised a hand protestingly. Don't, he said. You have no right to recoil from the mention of my love for you. Remember, this is a man talk. From the point of view of the talk, you are a man. The woman in you is only incidental, accidental, and irrelevant. You've got to listen to the bald statement of fact, strange though it is, that I love you. And now I won't bother you any more about love. We'll go on the same as before. You are better off and safer on Barande, in spite of the fact that I love you, than anywhere else in the Solomons. But I want you, as a final item of man talk, to remember, from time to time, that I love you, and that it will be the dearest day of my life when you consent to marry me. I want you to think of it sometimes. You can't help but think of it sometimes, and now we won't talk about it any more. As between men, there's my hand. He held out his hand. She hesitated, then gripped it heartily and smiled through her tears. I wish, she faltered, I wish, instead of that Black Mary, you'd given me somebody to swear for me. And with this enigmatic utterance, she turned away. Chapter 21. Contraband. Sheldon did not mention the subject again, nor did his conduct change from what it had always been. There was nothing of the pining lover, nor of the lover at all in his demeanor, nor was there any awkwardness between them. They were as frank and friendly in their relations as ever. He had wondered if his belligerent love declaration might have aroused some womanly self-consciousness in Joan, but he looked in vain for any sign of it. She appeared as unchanged as he, and while he knew that he hid his real feelings, he was firm in his belief that she hid nothing. And yet the germ he had implanted must be at work. He was confident of that, though he was without confidence as to the result. There was no forecasting this strange girl's processes. She might awaken, it was true, and on the other hand, and with equal chance, he might be the wrong man for her, and his declaration of love might only more firmly set her in her views on single blessedness. While he devoted more and more of his time to the plantation itself, she took over the house and its multitudinous affairs, and she took hold firmly, in sailor fashion, revolutionizing the system and discipline. The labor situation on Burundi was improving. The Martha had carried away 50 of the blacks whose time was up, and they had been among the worst on the plantation. 5-year men recruited by Billy B. Blode, men who had gone through the old days of terrorism when the original owners of Burundi had been driven away. The new recruits, being broken in under the new regime, gave better promise. Joan had joined with Sheldon from the start in the program that they must be gripped with the strong hand and at the same time be treated with absolute justice if they were to escape being contaminated by the older boys that still remained. "I think it would be a good idea to put all the gangs at work close to the house this afternoon," she announced one day at breakfast. "I've cleaned up the house, and you ought to clean up the barracks. There is too much stealing going on." "A good idea," Sheldon agreed. "Their boxes should be searched. I've just missed a couple of shirts, and my best toothbrush is gone. And 2 boxes of my cartridges," she added, "to say nothing of handkerchiefs, towels, sheets, and my best pair of slippers. But what they want with your toothbrush is more than I can imagine. They'll be stealing the billiard balls next." "One did disappear a few weeks before you came," Sheldon laughed. "We'll search the boxes this afternoon." And a busy afternoon it was. Joan and Sheldon, both armed, went through the barracks, house by house, the boss boys assisting, and half a dozen messengers, in relay, shouting along the line the names of the boys wanted. Each boy brought the key to his particular box and was permitted to look on while the contents were overhauled by the boss boys. A wealth of loot was recovered. There were fully a dozen cane knives, big hacking weapons with razor edges capable of decapitating a man at a stroke, towels, sheets, shirts, and slippers, along with toothbrushes, wisp brooms, soap, the missing billiard ball, and all the lost and forgotten trifles of many months came to light. But most astonishing was the quantity of ammunition cartridges for Lee Metfords, for Winchesters and Marlins, for revolvers from .32 caliber to .45, shotgun cartridges, Jones' 2 boxes of .38, cartridges of prodigious bore for the ancient Snyders of Maleta, flasks of black powder, sticks of dynamite, yards of fuse, and boxes of detonators. But the great find was in the house occupied by Gogumi and 5 Port Adams recruits. The fact that the boxes yielded nothing excited Sheldon's suspicions, and he gave orders to dig up the earthen floor. Wrapped in matting, well-oiled, free from rust and brand new, 2 Winchesters were first unearthed. Sheldon did not recognize them. They had not come from Burundi. Neither had the 40 flasks of black powder found under the corner post of the house. And while he could not be sure, he could remember no loss of 8 boxes of detonators. A big Colt's revolver he recognized as Huey Drummond's, while Joan identified a .32 Ivor and Johnson as a loss reported by Matapu the first week he landed at Burundi. The absence of any cartridges made Sheldon persist in the digging up of the floor, and a 50-pound flour tin was his reward. With glowering eyes, Gogumi looked on, while Sheldon took from the tin 100 rounds each for the 2 Winchesters and fully as many rounds more of nondescript cartridges of all sorts and makes and calibers. The contraband and stolen property was piled in assorted heaps on the back veranda of the bungalow. A few paces from the bottom of the steps were grouped the 40-odd culprits, with behind them, in solid array, the several hundred blacks of the plantation. At the head of the steps, Joan and Sheldon were seated, while on the steps stood the gang bosses. One by one, the culprits were called up and examined. Nothing definite could be extracted from them. They lied transparently but persistently, and when caught in one lie, explained it away with half a dozen others. One boy complacently announced that he had found 11 sticks of dynamite on the beach. Matapu's revolver, found in the box of one kapu, was explained away by that boy as having been given to him by Lervumi. Lervumi, called forth to testify, said he had got it from Noni. Noni had got it from Sulefatoi. Sulefatoi from Choka. Choka from Ngava. And Ngava completed the circle by stating that it had been given to him by Kapu. Kapu, thus doubly damned, calmly gave full details of how it had been given to him by Lervumi, and Lervumi, with equal wealth of detail, told how he had received it from Noni, and from Noni to Sulefatoi it went on around the circle again. Divers articles were traced indubitably to the houseboys, each of whom steadfastly proclaimed his own innocence and cast doubts on his fellows. The boy with the billiard ball said that he had never seen it in his life before, and hazarded the suggestion that it had got into his box through some mysterious and occultly evil agency. So far as he was concerned, it might have dropped down from heaven, for all he knew how it got there. To the cooks and boats' crews of every vessel that had dropped anchor off Baranda in the past several years were ascribed the arrival of scores of the stolen articles and of the major portion of the ammunition. There was no tracing the truth in any of it, though it was without doubt that the unidentified weapons and unfamiliar cartridges had come ashore off visiting craft. "Look at it," Sheldon said to Joan. "We've been sleeping over a volcano. They ought to be whipped." "No whip me," Gugumi cried out from below. "Father belong me, big fella chief. Me whip. Too much trouble along you. Close up, my word." "What name you fella Gugumi?" Sheldon shouted. "I knock 7 bells out of you. Here you Kwake, put 'em irons along that fella Gugumi." Kwak, a strapping gang boss, plucked Gugumi from out of his following and, helped by the other gang bosses, twisted his arms behind him and snapped on the heavy handcuffs. "Me finish along you, close up, you die altogether," Gugumi, with wrath-distorted face, threatened the boss boy. "Please, no whipping," Joan said in a low voice. "If whipping is necessary, send them to Tulagi and let the government do it. Give them their choice between a fine or an official whipping." Sheldon nodded and stood up, facing the blacks. "Manonmi!" he called. Manonmi stood forth and waited. "You fella boy bad fella too much," Sheldon charged. "You steal 'em plenty. You steal 'em 1 fella towel, 1 fella cane knife, 2 10-fella cartridge. My word, plenty bad fella steal 'em you. Me cross along you too much. Suppose you like 'em, me take 'em 1 fella pound along you in big book. Suppose you no like 'em, me take 'em 1 fella pound, then me send you fella along Tulagi. Catch 'em 1 strong fella government whipping. Plenty new Georgia boys, plenty Isabel boys, stop along jail along Tulagi. Them fella no like Malaita boys little bit. My word, they give 'em you strong fella whipping. What you say?" "You take 'em 1 fella pound along me," was the answer. And Manomi, patently relieved, stepped back, while Sheldon entered the fine in the Plantation Labor Journal. Boy after boy, he called the offenders out and gave them their choice, and boy by boy, each one elected to pay the fine imposed. Some fines were as low as several shillings, while in the more serious cases, such as thefts of guns and ammunition, the fines were correspondingly heavy. Gugumi and his 5 tribesmen were fined £3 each, and at Gogumi's guttural command, they refused to pay. "Suppose you go along to Lagi," Sheldon warned him. "You catch 'em strong fella whipping, and you stop along jail 3 fella year. Mr. Burnett, he look 'em along Winchester, look 'em along cartridge, look 'em along revolver, look 'em along black powder, look 'em along dynamite. My word, he crossed too much, he give you 3 fella year along jail. S'pose you know like 'em pay 3 fella pound, you stop along jail. Savvy?" Gogumi wavered. "It's true. That's what Burnett would give them," Sheldon said in an aside to Joan. "You take 'em 3 fella pound along me," Gogumi muttered, at the same time scowling his hatred at Sheldon and transferring half the scowl to Joan and Quark. "Me finish along you, you catch 'em big fella trouble, my word. Father belong me big fella chief along Port Adams." "That will do," Sheldon warned him. "You shut mouth belong you." "Me no fright," the son of a chief retorted, by his insolence increasing his stature in the eyes of his fellows. "Lock him up for tonight," Sheldon said to Quark. "Son, he come up, put him that fella, and 5 fella belong him along grass cutting. Savvy?" Quake grinned. "Me savvy," he said. "Cut 'em grass, ngari 4. Stop 'em along grass. My word." "There will be trouble with Gogumi yet," Sheldon said to Joan, as the boss boys marshaled their gangs and led them away to their work. "Keep an eye on him. Be careful when you are riding alone on the plantation. The loss of those Winchesters and all that ammunition has hit him harder than your cuffing did. He is dead ripe for mischief." Chapter 22. Gogumi finishes along Quaki altogether. I wonder what has become of Tudor. It's 2 months since he disappeared into the bush, and not a word of him after he left Binu. Joan Lackland was sitting astride her horse by the bank of the Balasuna, where the sweet corn had been planted, and Sheldon, who had come across from the house on foot, was leaning against her horse's shoulder. "Yes, it is a long time for no news to have trickled down," he answered, watching her keenly from under his hat brim, and wondering as to the measure of her anxiety for the adventurous gold hunter. "But Tudor will come out all right. He did a thing at the start that I wouldn't have given him or any other man credit for. Persuaded Binu Charlie to go along with him. I'll wager no other Binu nigger has ever gone so far into the bush unless to be kai-kai'd. As for Tudor—" "Look, look!" Joan cried in a low voice, pointing across the narrow stream to a slack eddy where a huge crocodile drifted like a log awash. "My, I wish I had my rifle." The crocodile, leaving scarcely a ripple behind, sank down and disappeared. "A Binu man was in early this morning, for medicine," Sheldon remarked. "It may have been that very brute that was responsible. A dozen of the Binu women were out, and the foremost one stepped right on a big crocodile. It was by the edge of the water, and he tumbled her over and got her by the leg. All the other women got hold of her and pulled, and in the tug-of-war, she lost her leg below the knee," he said. "I gave him a stock of antiseptics. She'll pull through, I fancy." "Ugh, the filthy beasts," Joan gulped shudderingly. "I hate them, I hate them." "And yet you go diving among sharks," Sheldon chided. "They're only fish sharks, and as long as there are plenty of fish, there is no danger. It is only when they're famished that they're liable to take a bite." Sheldon shuddered inwardly at the swift vision that arose of the dainty flesh of her in a shark's many-toothed maw. "I wish you wouldn't, just the same," he said slowly. "You acknowledge there is a risk." "But that's half the fun of it," she cried. A trite platitude about his not caring to lose her was on his lips, but he refrained from uttering it. Another conclusion he had arrived at was that she was not to be nagged. Continual, or even occasional reminders of his feeling for her would constitute a tactical error of no mean dimensions. Some for the book of verse, some for the simple life, and some for the shark's belly, he laughed grimly, then added, just the same, I wish I could swim as well as you. Maybe it would beget confidence, such as you have. Do you know, I think it would be nice to be married to a man such as you seem to be becoming, she remarked, with one of her abrupt changes that always astounded him. I should think you could be trained into a very good husband. You know, not one of the domineering kind, but one who considered his wife was just as much an individual as himself and just as much a free agent. Really, you know, I think you are improving. She laughed and rode away, leaving him greatly cast down. If he had thought there had been one bit of coyness in her words, one feminine flutter, one womanly attempt at deliberate lure and encouragement, he would have been elated. But he knew absolutely that it was the boy, and not the woman, who had so daringly spoken. Joan rode on among the avenues of young coconut palms, saw a hornbill, followed it in its erratic flights to the high forest on the edge of the plantation, heard the cooing of wild pigeons, and located them in the deeper woods, followed the fresh trail of a wild pig. For a distance, circled back, and took the narrow path for the bungalow that ran through 20 acres of uncleared cane. The grass was waist-high and higher, and as she rode along, she remembered that Gogumi was one of a gang of boys that had been detailed to the grass-cutting. She came to where they had been at work, but saw no signs of them. Her unshod horse made no sound on the soft, sandy footing, and a little further on, she heard voices proceeding from out of the grass. She reined in and listened. It was Gogumi talking, and as she listened, she gripped her bridle rein tightly, and a wave of anger passed over her. Dog, he stop him along house. Night time he walk about, Gogumi was saying, perforce in bêche de mer English, because he was talking to others beside his own tribesmen. You fella boy, catch him one fella pig. Put him kai-kai, belong him along big fella fish hook. S'pose dog, he walk about catch him kai-kai. You fella boy, catch him dog, ali same one shark. Dog, he finish close up. Big fella master sleep along big fella house. White Mary, sleep along Pickaninny house. One fella Adamu, he stop along outside Pickaninny house. You fella boy, finish 'em dog, finish 'em Adamu, finish 'em big fella master, finish 'em White Mary, finish 'em all together. Plenty musket he stop, plenty powder, plenty tomahawk, plenty knife fee, plenty porpoise teeth, plenty tobacco, plenty calico. My word, too much plenty. Everything we take 'em along whaleboat, washy vive like hell, sun he come up, we long way too much. Me catch 'em pigson, he go down, spoke up one whose thin, falsetto voice Joan recognized as belonging to Kossi, one of Gogumi's tribesmen. Me catch 'em dog, said another. And me catch 'em white fella Mary, Gogumi cried triumphantly. Me catch 'em Kwaki, he die along him damn quick. This much Joan heard of the plan to murder, and then her rising wrath proved too much for her discretion. She spurred her horse into the grass, crying, "What name you fella boy, eh? What name?" They arose, scrambling and scattering, and to her surprise, she saw there were a dozen of them. As she looked in their glowering faces and noted the heavy 2-foot hacking cane knives in their hands, she became suddenly aware of the rashness of her act. If only she had had her revolver or a rifle, all would have been well. But she had carelessly ventured out unarmed, and she followed the glance of Gogumi to her waist and saw the pleased flash in his eyes as he perceived the absence of the dreadful man-killing revolver. The first article in the Solomon Islands Code for white men was never to show fear before a native, and Joan tried to carry off the situation in cavalier fashion. "Too much talk along you fella boy," she said severely. "Too much talk. Too little work. Savvy?" Gugumi made no reply, but apparently shifting weight, he slid 1 foot forward. The other boys, spread fan-wise about her, were also sliding forward, the cruel cane knives in their hands advertising their intention. "You cut 'em grass," she commanded imperatively. But Gugumi slid his other foot forward. She measured the distance with her eye. It would be impossible to whirl her horse around and get away. She would be chopped down from behind. And in that tense moment, the faces of all of them were imprinted on her mind in an unforgettable picture. One of them, an old man, with torn and distended earlobes that fell to his chest. Another, with the broad flattened nose of Africa, and with withered eyes so buried under frowning brows that nothing but the sickly, yellowish-looking whites could be seen. A third, thick-lipped and bearded with kinky whiskers. And Gogumi. She had never realized before how handsome Gogumi was in his mutinous and obstinate, wild animal way. There was a primitive aristocraticness about him that his fellows lacked. The lines of his figure were more rounded than theirs, the skin smooth, well-oiled and free from disease. On his chest, suspended from a single string of porpoise teeth around his throat, hung a big crescent carved out of opalescent pearl shell. A row of pure white cowrie shells banded his brow. From his hair drooped a long, lone feather. Above the swelling calf of one leg he wore, as a garter, a single string of white beads. The effect was dandyish in the extreme. A narrow G-string completed his costume. Another man she saw, old and shriveled, with puckered forehead and a puckered face that trembled and worked with animal passion, as in the past she had noticed the faces of monkeys tremble and work. "Gogumi," she said sharply, "you no cut 'em grass, my word. I bang 'em head belong you." His expression became a trifle more disdainful, but he did not answer. Instead, he stole a glance to right and left to mark how his fellows were closing about her. At the same moment, he casually slipped his foot forward through the grass for a matter of several inches. Joan was keenly aware of the desperateness of the situation. The only way out was through. She lifted her riding whip threateningly, and at the same moment drove in both spurs with her heels, rushing the startled horse straight at Gogumi. It all happened in an instant. Every cane knife was lifted, and every boy save Gogumi leapt for her. He swerved aside to avoid the horse, at the same time swinging his cane knife in a slicing blow that would have cut her in twain. She leaned forward under the flying steel, which cut through her riding skirt, through the edge of the saddle, through the saddlecloth, and even slightly into the horse itself. Her right hand, still raised, came down, the thin whip wishing through the air. She saw the white, cooked mark of the wheel clear across the sullen, handsome face, and still what was practically in the same instant, she saw the man with the puckered face, overridden, go down before her, and she heard his snarling and grimacing chatter for all the world like an angry monkey. Then she was free and away, heading the horse at top speed for the house. Out of her sea training, she was able to appreciate Sheldon's executiveness when she burst in on him with her news. Springing from the steamer chair in which he had been lounging while waiting for breakfast, he clapped his hands for the houseboys, and while listening to her, he was buckling on his cartridge belt and running the mechanism of his automatic pistol. "On fiery," he snapped out his orders. "You fella ring big fella bell, strong fella plenty. You finish 'em bell, you put 'em saddle on horse. Via Buri, you go quick house, belong Sealy he stop. Tell 'em plenty black fella run away. 10 fella, 2 fella, black fella boy. He scribbled a note and handed it to Lala Peru. Lala Peru, you go quick house belong white fella Master Bouchy. That will head them back from the coast on both sides, he explained to Joan. And old Seeley will turn his whole village loose on their track as well. In response to the summons of the big bell, Joan's Tahitians were the first to arrive, by their glistening bodies and panting chests, showing that they had run all the way. Some of the farthest placed gangs would be nearly an hour in arriving. Sheldon proceeded to arm Joan's sailors and deal out ammunition and handcuffs. Adamu Adam, with loaded rifle, he placed on guard over the whaleboats. Noah, aided by Matapu, were instructed to take charge of the working gangs as fast as they came in, to keep them amused and to guard against their being stampeded into making a break themselves. The 5 other Tahitians were to follow Joan and Sheldon on foot. I'm glad we unearthed that arsenal the other day, Sheldon remarked as they rode out of the compound gate. 100 yards away, they encountered one of the clearing gangs coming in. It was Quacky's gang, but Sheldon looked in vain for him. What name that fella Quacker he knows stop along you? He demanded. A babel of excited voices attempted an answer. Shut 'em mouth belong you all together, Sheldon commanded. He spoke roughly, living up to the role of the white man who must always be strong and dominant. Here, you fella Babatani, you talk 'em mouth belong you. Babatani stepped forward, in all the pride of one singled out from among his fellows. Gugumi, he finish along Quacky altogether, was Babatani's explanation. He take 'em head belong, him run like hell. In brief words, and with paucity of imagination, he described the murder, and Sheldon and Joan rode on. In the grass, where Joan had been attacked, they found the little shriveled man, still chattering and grimacing, whom Joan had ridden down. The mare had plunged on his ankle, completely crushing it, and 100 yards crawl had convinced him of the futility of escape. To the last clearing gang, from the farthest edge of the plantation, was given the task of carrying him in to the house. A mile farther on, where the runaways' trail led straight toward the bush, they encountered the body of Quack. The head had been hacked off and was missing, and Sheldon took it on faith that the body was Quacky's. He had evidently put up a fight, for a bloody trail led away from the body. Once they were well into the thick bush, the horses had to be abandoned. Papahara was left in charge of them, while Joan and Sheldon and the remaining Tahitians pushed ahead on foot. The way led down through a swampy hollow, which was overflowed by the Barande River on occasion, and where the red trail of the murderers was crossed by a crocodile's trail. They had apparently caught the creature asleep in the sun and desisted long enough from their flight to hack him to pieces. Here, the wounded man had sat down and waited until they were ready to go on. An hour later, following along a wild pig trail, Sheldon suddenly halted. The bloody tracks had ceased. The Tahitians cast out in the bush on either side, and a cry from Utami apprised them of a find. Joan waited till Sheldon came back. It's Mauko, he said. Quacker did for him, and he crawled in there and died. That's 2 accounted for. There are 10 more. Don't you think you've got enough of it? She nodded. It isn't nice, she said. I'll go back and wait for you with the horses. But you can't go alone. Take 2 of the men. Then I'll go on, she said. It would be foolish to weaken the pursuit, and I am certainly not tired. The trail bent to the right, as though the runaways had changed their mind and headed for the Balisuna. But the trail still continued to bend to the right till it promised to make a loop, and the point of intersection seemed to be the edge of the plantation where the horses had been left. Crossing one of the quiet jungle spaces, where naught moved but a velvety 12-inch butterfly, they heard the sound of shots. 8, Joan counted. It was only one gun. It must be Papahara. They hurried on, but when they reached the spot, they were in doubt. The two horses stood quietly tethered, and Papahara, squatted on his hams, was having a peaceful smoke. Advancing toward him, Sheldon tripped on a body that lay in the grass, and as he saved himself from falling, his eyes lighted on a second. Joan recognized this one. It was Kossi, one of Gugumi's tribesmen, the one who had promised to catch at sunset the pig that was to have baited the hook for Satan. "No luck, missy," was Papahara's greeting, accompanied by a disconsolate shake of the head. "Catch only 2, boy. I have good shot at Gugumi, only I miss." "But you killed them," Joan chided. "You must catch them alive." The Tahitian smiled. "How?" he queried. "I am have a smoke. I think about Tahiti and breadfruit and jolly good time at Bora Bora. Quick, just like that, 10 boy he run out of bush for me. Each boy have long knife. Gugumi have long knife one hand, and Kwake's head in other hand. I no stop to catch 'em alive. I shoot like hell. How you catch 'em alive, 10 boy, 10 long knife, and Kwake's head?" The scattered paths of the different boys, where they broke back after the disastrous attempt to rush the Tahitian, soon led together. They traced it to the Barande, which the runaways had crossed with the clear intention of burying themselves in the huge mangrove swamp that lay beyond. "There is no use our going any farther," Sheldon said. "Seeley will turn out his village and hunt them out of that. They'll never get past him. All we can do is to guard the coast and keep them from breaking back on the plantation and running amok." "Ah, I thought so." Against the jungle gloom of the farther shore, coming from downstream, a small canoe glided. So silently did it move that it was more like an apparition. 3 naked blacks, dipped with noiseless paddles. Long-hafted, slender, bone-barbed, throwing spears lay along the gunwale of the canoe, while a quiverful of arrows hung on each man's back. The eyes of the manhunters missed nothing. They had seen Sheldon and Joan first, but they gave no sign. Where Gugumi and his followers had emerged from the river, the canoe abruptly stopped, then turned and disappeared into the deeper mangrove gloom. A second and a third canoe came around the bend from below, glided ghost-like to the crossing of the runaways, and vanished in the mangroves. "I hope there won't be any more killing," Joan said, as they turned their horses homeward. "I don't think so," Sheldon assured her. "My understanding with old Seeley is that he is paid only for live boys, so he is very careful." Chapter 23. A Message from the Bush. Never had runaways from Barande been more zealously hunted. The deeds of Gugumi and his fellows had been a bad example for the 150 new recruits. Murder had been planned, a gang boss had been killed, and the murderers had broken their contracts by fleeing to the bush. Sheldon saw how imperative it was to teach his new court cannibals that bad examples were disastrous things to pattern after, and he urged Seeley on night and day, while with the Tahitians he practically lived in the bush, leaving Joan in charge of the plantation. To the north, Boucher did good work, twice turning the fugitives back when they attempted to gain the coast. One by one, the boys were captured. In the first man-drive through the mangrove swamp, Seeley caught 2. Circling around to the north, a third was wounded in the thigh by Boucher. And this one, dragging behind in the chase, was later gathered in by Seeley's hunters. The 3 captives, heavily ironed, were exposed each day in the compound, as good examples of what happened to bad examples, all for the edification of the 70 half-wild Punga Punga men. Then the Minerva, running past for Tulagi, was signaled to send a boat, and the 3 prisoners were carried away to prison to await trial. 5 were still at large, but escape was impossible. They could not get down to the coast, nor dared they venture too far inland for fear of the wild bushmen. Then one of the 5 came in voluntarily and gave himself up, and Sheldon learned that Gogumi and 2 others were all that were at large. There should have been a 4th, but according to the man who had given himself up, the 4th man had been killed and eaten. It had been fear of a similar fate that had driven him in. He was a Malu man from northwestern Malaita, as likewise had been the one that was eaten. Gogumi's 2 other companions were from Port Adams. As for himself, the black declared his preference for government trial and punishment to being eaten by his companions in the bush. "Close up, Gogumi kai me," he said. "My word, me no like boy, kai me." 3 days later, Sheldon caught one of the boys, helpless from swamp fever and unable to fight or run away. On the same day, Seeley caught the second boy in similar condition. Gogumi alone remained at large, and as the pursuit closed in on him, he conquered his fear of the bushmen and headed straight in for the mountainous backbone of the island. Sheldon, with 4 Tahitians, and Seeley, with 30 of his hunters, followed Gogumi's trail a dozen miles into the open grasslands, and then Seeley and his people lost heart. He confessed that neither he nor any of his tribe had ever ventured so far inland before, and he narrated for Sheldon's benefit most horrible tales of the horrible bushmen. In the old days, he said, they had crossed the grasslands and attacked the saltwater natives, but since the coming of the white men to the coast, they had remained in their interior fastnesses, and no saltwater native had ever seen them again. "Gogumi he finish along them fella bushmen," he assured Sheldon. "My word, he finish close up, kai altogether." So the expedition turned back. Nothing could persuade the coast natives to venture farther, and Sheldon, with his 4 Tahitians, knew that it was madness to go on alone. So he stood waist-deep in the grass and looked regretfully across the rolling savannah and the soft-swelling foothills to the Lion's Head, a massive peak of rock that upreared into the azure from the midmost center of Guadalcanal, a landmark used for bearings by every coasting mariner, a mountain as yet untrod by the foot of a white man. That night, after dinner, Sheldon and Joan were playing billiards when Satan barked in the compound, and Lala Peru, sent to sea, brought back a tired and travel-stained native who wanted to talk with the big fella white master. It was only the man's insistence that procured him admittance at such an hour. Sheldon went out on the veranda to see him, and at first glance at the gaunt features and wasted body of the man, knew that his errand was likely to prove important. Nevertheless, Sheldon demanded roughly, "What name you come along house? Belong me son he go down." "Me, Charlie," the man muttered apologetically and wearily. "Me stop along Binu." "Ah, Binu Charlie, eh? Well, what name you talk along me? What place big fella master along white man he stop?" Joan and Sheldon together listened to the tale Binu Charlie had brought. He described Tudor's expedition up the Balasuna, the dragging of the boats up the rapids, the passage up the river where it threaded the grass lands, the innumerable washings of gravel by the white men in search of gold, the first rolling foothills, the man-traps of spear-staked pits in the jungle trails, the first meeting with the bushmen who had never seen tobacco and knew not the virtues of smoking, their friendliness, the deeper penetration of the interior around the flanks of the Lion's Head, the bush saws and the fevers of the white men, and their madness in trusting the bushman. "Alley time, I talk along white fella master," he said. "Me talk, that fella bushman, he look I belong him. He savvy too much. S'pose musket he stop along you. That fella bushman, he too much good friend along you. Alley time, he look sharp, I belong him. S'pose musket he no stop along you, my word. That fella bushman he chop him off head, belong you. He kai you all together." But the patience of the bushman had exceeded that of the white men. The weeks had gone by, and no overt acts had been attempted. The bushmen swarmed in the camp in increasing numbers, and they were always making presents of yams and taro, of pig and fowl, and of wild fruits and vegetables. Whenever the gold hunters moved their camp, the bushmen volunteered to carry the luggage, and the white men waxed ever more careless. They grew weary prospecting, and at the same time carrying their rifles and the heavy cartridge belts, and the practice began of leaving their weapons behind them in camp. "I tell 'em plenty fella white master look sharp I belong him, and plenty fella white master make 'em big laugh along me, say Binu Charlie alley same pickaninny. My word, they speak along me, alley same pickaninny." Came the morning when Binu Charlie noticed that the women and children had disappeared. Tudor, at the time, was lying in a stupor with fever in a late camp 5 miles away, the main camp having moved on those 5 miles in order to prospect an outcrop of likely quartz. Binu Charlie was midway between the two camps when the absence of the women and children struck him as suspicious. "My word," he said, "me tink like hell. Him Black Mary, him pickaninny walk about long way big bit. What name? Me savvy too much trouble close up. Me fright like hell. Me run. My word, me run." Tudor, quite unconscious, was slung across his shoulder and carried a mile down the trail. Here, hiding new trail, Binu Charlie had carried him for a quarter of a mile into the heart of the deepest jungle and hidden him in a big banyan tree. Returning to try to save the rifles and personal outfit, Binu Charlie had seen a party of bushmen trotting down the trail and had hidden in the bush. Here, and from the direction of the main camp, he had heard 2 rifle shots, and that was all. He had never seen the white men again, nor had he ventured near their old camp. He had gone back to Tudor and hidden with him for a week, living on wild fruits and the few pigeons and cockatoos he had been able to shoot with bow and arrow. Then he had journeyed down to Baranda to bring the news. Tudor, he said, was very sick, lying unconscious for days at a time, and when in his right mind, too weak to help himself. "What name you know kill him that big fella master?" Joan demanded. "He have 'em good fella musket, plenty calico, plenty tobacco, plenty knife fee, and 2 fella pickaninny musket shoot quick, bang, 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 just like that." The black smiled cunningly. "Me savvy too much. S'pose me kill 'em big fella master. By plenty white fella master walk about Binu cross like hell. What name this fellow musket? Those plenty fella white master talk, along me. My word, Binu Charlie finish altogether. S'pose me kill him, no good along me. Plenty white fella master cross along me. S'pose me no kill him, by he give me plenty tobacco, plenty calico, plenty everything too much." "There is only the one thing to do," Sheldon said to Joan. She drummed with her hand and waited, while Binu Charlie gazed wearily at her with unblinking eyes. "I'll start the first thing in the morning," Sheldon said. "We'll start," she corrected. "I can get twice as much out of my Tahitians as you can, and besides, one white should never be alone under such circumstances." He shrugged his shoulders in token, not of consent, but of surrender, knowing the uselessness of attempting to argue the question with her, and consoling himself with the reflection that heaven alone knew what adventures she was liable to engage in if left alone on Barande for a week. He clapped his hands, and for the next quarter of an hour, the houseboys were kept busy carrying messages to the barracks. A man was sent to Balasuna village to command Old Seely's immediate presence. A boat's crew was started in a whaleboat with word for Bauchi to come down. Ammunition was issued to the Tahitians and the storeroom overhauled for a few days' tinned provisions. Viaburi turned yellow when told that he was to accompany the expedition, and to everybody's surprise, Lalaperu volunteered to take his place. Seeley arrived, proud in his importance, that the great master of Barande should summon him in the night time for counsel, and firm in his refusal to step 1 inch within the dread domain of the Bushmen. As he said, if his opinion had been asked when the gold hunters started, he would have foretold their disastrous end. There was only one thing that happened to anyone who ventured into the Bushman's territory, and that was that he was eaten, and he would further say without being asked that if Sheldon went up into the bush, he would be eaten too. Sheldon sent for a gang boss and told him to bring 10 of the biggest, best, and strongest Punga Punga men. Not saltwater boys, Sheldon cautioned, but bush boys. Leg belong him strong fella leg. Boy no savvy musket, no good. You bring 'em boy shoot musket strong fella. They were 10 picked men that filed up on the veranda and stood in the glare of the lanterns. Their heavy, muscular legs advertised that they were bushmen. Each claimed long experience in bush fighting. Most of them showed scars of bullet or spear thrust in proof, and all were wild for a chance to break the humdrum monotony of plantation labor by going on a killing expedition. Killing was their natural vocation, not woodcutting, and while they would not have ventured the Guadalcanar bush alone, with a white man like Sheldon behind them, and a white Mary, such as they knew Joan to be, they could expect a safe and delightful time. Besides, the great master had told them that the 8 gigantic Tahitians were going along. The Punga Punga volunteers stood with glistening eyes and grinning faces, naked save for their loincloths and barbarously ornamented. Each wore a flat, turtle-shell ring suspended through his nose, and each carried a clay pipe in an ear hole, or thrust inside a beaded biceps armlet. A pair of magnificent boar tusks graced the chest of one. On the chest of another hung a huge disc of polished fossil clamshell. "Plenty strong fella fight," Sheldon warned them in conclusion. They grinned and shifted delightedly. "S'pose Bushmen kai along you?" he queried. "No fear," answered their spokesman, one Kugu, a strapping, thick-lipped, Ethiopian-looking man. "S'pose Punga Punga boy kai bush boy?" Sheldon shook his head, laughing, and dismissed them, and went to overhaul the dunnage room for a small shelter tent for Joan's use. Chapter 24. In the Bush. It was quite a formidable expedition that departed from Barande at break of day next morning in a fleet of canoes and dinghies. There were Joan and Sheldon, with Binu Charlie and Lalaperu, the 8 Tahitians, and the 10 Punga Punga men, each proud in the possession of a bright and shining modern rifle. In addition, there were 2 of the plantation boat's crews of 6 men each. These, however, were to go no farther than Kali, where water transportation ceased, and where they were to wait with the boats. Bauchi remained behind, in charge of Baranda. By 11 in the morning, the expedition arrived at Binu, a cluster of 20 houses on the riverbank, and from here 30-odd Binu men accompanied them, armed with spears and arrows, chattering and grimacing with delight at the warlike array. The long, quiet stretches of river gave way to swifter water, and progress was slower and more dogged. The Balasuna grew shallow as well, and oftener were the loaded boats bumped along and half-lifted over the bottom. In places, timber falls blocked the passage of the narrow stream, and the boats and canoes were portaged around. Night brought them to Kali, and they had the satisfaction of knowing that they had accomplished in one day what had required 2 days for Tudor's expedition. Here at Kali next morning, halfway through the grasslands, the boat's crews were left, and with them the horde of Binu men, the boldest of which held on for a bare mile and then ran scampering back. Binu Charlie, however, was at the fore and led the way onward into the rolling foothills, following the trail made by Tudor and his men weeks before. That night they camped well into the hills and deep in the tropic jungle. The third day found them on the runways of the Bushmen, narrow paths that compelled single file, and that turned and twisted with endless convolutions through the dense undergrowth. For the most part, it was a silent forest, lush and dank, where only occasionally a wood pigeon cooed or snow-white cockatoos laughed harshly in laborious flight. Here, in the mid-morning, the first casualty occurred. Binu Charlie had dropped behind for a time, and Kugu, the Punga Punga man who had boasted that he would eat the Bushmen, was in the lead. Joan and Sheldon heard the twanging thrum and saw Kugu throw out his arms, at the same time dropping his rifle, stumble forward and sink down on his hands and knees. Between his naked shoulders, low down and to the left, appeared the bone-barbed head of an arrow. He had been shot through and through. Cocked rifles swept the bush with nervous apprehension. But there was no rustle, no movement, nothing but the humid, oppressive silence. "Bushman, he no stop," Binu Charlie called out, the sound of his voice startling more than one of them. "Ali, same damn funny business. That fella Kugu no look am I belong him. He no savvy little bit." Kugu's arms had crumpled under him, and he lay quivering where he had fallen. Even as Binu Charlie came to the front, the stricken black's breath passed from him, and with a final convulsive stir, he lay still. "Right through the heart," Sheldon said, straightening up from the stooping examination. "It must have been a trap of some sort." He noticed Joan's white, tense face and the wide eyes with which she stared at the wreck of what had been a man the minute before. "I recruited that boy myself," she said in a whisper. "He came down out of the bush at Punga Punga and right on board the Martha and offered himself, and I was proud. He was my very first recruit." "My word. Look'm that fella," Binu Charlie interrupted, brushing aside the leafy wall of the runway and exposing a bow so massive that no one bushman could have bent it. The Binu man traced out the mechanics of the trap and exposed the hidden fiber in the tangled undergrowth that at contact with Kugu's foot had released the taut bow. They were deep in the primeval forest. A dim twilight prevailed, for no random shaft of sunlight broke through the thick roof of leaves and creepers overhead. The Tahitians were plainly awed by the silence and gloom and mystery of the place and happening, but they showed themselves doggedly unafraid and were for pushing on. The Punga Punga men, on the contrary, were not awed. They were bushmen themselves, and they were used to this silent warfare, though the devices were different from those employed by them in their own bush. Most awed of all were Joan and Sheldon, but being whites, they were not supposed to be subject to such commonplace emotions, and their task was to carry the situation off with careless bravado as befitted big fella masters of the dominant breed. Binu Charlie took the lead as they pushed on, and trap after trap yielded its secret lurking place to his keen scrutiny. The way was beset with 1,000 annoyances, chiefest among which were thorns cunningly concealed that penetrated the bare feet of the invaders. Once, during the afternoon, Binu Charlie barely missed being impaled in a staked pit that undermined the trail. There were times when all stood still and waited for half an hour or more, while Binu Charlie prospected suspicious parts of the trail. Sometimes he was compelled to leave the trail and creep and climb through the jungle so as to approach the man-traps from behind, and on one occasion, in spite of his precaution, a spring bow was discharged, the flying arrow barely clipping the shoulder of one of the waiting Punga Punga boys. Where a slight runway entered the main one, Sheldon paused and asked Binu Charlie if he knew where it led. "Plenty bush fella garden, he stop along there short way little bit," was the answer. "All right, you like 'em, go look 'em along." "Walk 'em easy," he cautioned a few minutes later. "Close up, that fella garden. S'pose some bush fella he stop, we catch 'em." Creeping ahead and peering into the clearing for a moment, Binu Charlie beckoned Sheldon to come on cautiously. Joan crouched beside him, and together they peeped out. The cleared space was fully half an acre in extent and carefully fenced against the wild pigs. Pawpaw and banana trees were just ripening their fruit, while beneath grew sweet potatoes and yams. On one edge of the clearing was a small grass house, open-sided, a mere rain shelter. In front of it, crouched on his hams before a fire, was a gaunt and bearded bushman. The fire seemed to smoke excessively, and in the thick of the smoke, a round, dark object hung suspended. The bushman seemed absorbed in contemplation of this object. Warning them not to shoot unless the man was successfully escaping, Sheldon beckoned the Punga Punga men forward. Joan smiled appreciatively to Sheldon. It was headhunters against headhunters. The blacks trod noiselessly to their stations, which were arranged so that they could spring simultaneously into the open. Their faces were keen and serious, their eyes eloquent with the ecstasy of living that was upon them. For this was living, this game of life and death, and to them it was the only game a man should play. Withal they played it in low and cowardly ways, killing from behind in the dim forest gloom, and rarely coming out into the open. Sheldon whispered the word, and the 10 runners leaped forward, for Binu Charlie ran with them. The bushman's keen ears warned him, and he sprang to his feet, bow and arrow in hand, the arrow fixed in the notch and the bow bending as he sprang. The man he let drive at dodged the arrow, and before he could shoot another, his enemies were upon him. He was rolled over and dragged to his feet, disarmed and helpless. "Why, he's an ancient Babylonian," Joan cried regarding him. "He's an Assyrian, a Phoenician. Look at that straight nose, that narrow face, those high cheekbones, and that slanting, oval forehead, and the beard, and the eyes, too. And the snaky locks," Sheldon laughed. The bushman was in mortal fear, led by all his training to expect nothing less than death. Yet he did not cower away from them. Instead, he returned their looks with lean self-sufficiency, and finally centered his gaze upon Joan, the first white woman he had ever seen. "My word, bush fella kai along that fella boy," Binu Charlie remarked. So stolid was his manner of utterance that Joan turned carelessly to see what had attracted his attention, and found herself face to face with Gugumi. At least, it was the head of Gugumi, the dark object they had seen hanging in the smoke. It was fresh. The smoke curing had just begun, and save for the closed eyes, all the sullen handsomeness and animal virility of the boy, as Joan had known it, was still to be seen in the monstrous thing that twisted and dangled in the eddying smoke. Nor was Joan's horror lessened by the conduct of the Punga Punga boys. On the instant they recognized the head, and on the instant rose their wild, hearty laughter as they explained to one another in shrill falsetto voices. Gugumi's end was a joke. He had been foiled in his attempt to escape. He had played the game and lost. And what greater joke could there be than that the Bushmen should have eaten him? It was the funniest incident that had come under their notice in many a day, and to them there was certainly nothing unusual nor bizarre in the event. Gugumi had completed the life cycle of the Bushman. He had taken heads, and now his own head had been taken. He had eaten men, and now he had been eaten by men. The Punga Punga men's laughter died down, and they regarded the spectacle with glittering eyes and gluttonous expressions. The Tahitians, on the other hand, were shocked, and Adamu Adam was shaking his head slowly and grunting forth his disgust. Joan was angry. Her face was white, but in each cheek was a vivid spray of red. Disgust had been displaced by wrath, and her mood was clearly vengeful. Sheldon laughed. "It's nothing to be angry over," he said. "You mustn't forget that he hacked off Quack's head and that he ate one of his own comrades that ran away with him. Besides, he was born to it. He has but been eaten out of the same trough from which he himself has eaten." Joan looked at him with lips that trembled on the verge of speech. "And don't forget," Sheldon added, "that he is the son of a chief, and that as sure as fate his Port Adams tribesmen will take a white man's head in payment." "It is all so ghastly ridiculous," Joan finally said. "And, romantic," he suggested slyly. She did not answer and turned away, but Sheldon knew that the shaft had gone home. "That fella boy, he's sick. Belly belong him walk about," Binu Charlie said, pointing to the Punga Punga man whose shoulder had been scratched by the arrow an hour before. The boy was sitting down and groaning, his arms clasping his bent knees, his head drooped forward and rolling painfully back and forth. For fear of poison, Sheldon had immediately scarified the wound and injected permanganate of potash, but in spite of the precaution, the shoulder was swelling rapidly. "We'll take him on to where Tudor is lying," Joan said. "The walking will help to keep up his circulation and scatter the poison. Adamu, Adam, you take hold that boy. Maybe he will want to sleep. Shake him up. If he sleep, he die." The advance was more rapid now, for Binu Charlie placed the captive bushman in front of him and made him clear the runway of traps. Once, at a sharp turn, where a man's shoulder would unavoidably brush against a screen of leaves, the bushman displayed great caution as he spread the leaves aside and exposed the head of a sharp-pointed spear, so set that the casual passer-by would receive at the least a nasty scratch. "My word," said Binu Charlie, "that fella Spear Ali, same devil." He took the spear and was examining it when suddenly he made as if to stick it into the bushman. It was a bit of simulated playfulness, but the bushman sprang back in evident fright. Poisoned the weapon was beyond any doubt, and thereafter Binu Charlie carried it threateningly at the prisoner's back. The sun, sinking behind a lofty western peak, brought on an early but lingering twilight, and the expedition plodded on through the evil forest, the place of mystery and fear, of death swift and silent and horrible, of brutish appetite and degraded instinct, of human life that still wallowed in the primeval slime, of savagery degenerate and abysmal. No slightest breezes blew in the gloomy silence, and the air was stale and humid and suffocating. The sweat poured unceasingly from their bodies, and in their nostrils was the heavy smell of rotting vegetation and of black earth that was a crawl with fecund life. They turned aside from the runway at a place indicated by Binu Charlie, and sometimes crawling on hands and knees through the damp black muck, at other times creeping and climbing through the tangled undergrowth a dozen feet from the ground. They came to an immense banyan tree, half an acre in extent, that made in the innermost heart of the jungle a denser jungle of its own. From out of its black depths came the voice of a man, singing in a cracked, eerie voice. "My word, that big fella master he no die." The singing stopped, and the voice, faint and weak, called out a hello. Joan answered, and then the voice explained. "I'm not wandering. I was just singing to keep my spirits up. Have you got anything to eat?" A few minutes saw the rescued man lying among blankets, while fires were building, water was being carried, Joan's tent was going up, and Lalaperu was overhauling the packs and opening tins of provisions. Tudor, having pulled through the fever and started to mend, was still frightfully weak and very much starved. So badly swollen was he from mosquito bites that his face was unrecognizable, and the acceptance of his identity was largely a matter of faith. Joan had her own ointments along, and she prefaced their application by fomenting his swollen features with hot cloths. Sheldon, with an eye to the camp and the preparations for the night, looked on and felt the pangs of jealousy at every contact of her hands with Tudor's face and body. Somehow, engaged in their healing ministrations, they no longer seemed to him boys' hands, the hands of Joan, who had gazed at Gugumi's head with pale cheeks sprayed with angry flame. The hands were now a woman's hands, and Sheldon grinned to himself as his fancy suggested that some night he must lie outside the mosquito netting in order to have Joan apply soothing fomentations in the morning. Chapter 25. The Head Hunters. The morning's action had been settled the night before. Tudor was to stay behind in his banyan refuge and gather strength while the expedition proceeded. On the far chance that they might rescue even one solitary survivor of Tudor's party, Joan was fixed in her determination to push on, and neither Sheldon nor Tudor could persuade her to remain quietly at the banyan tree while Sheldon went on and searched. With Tudor, Adamu, Adam, and Arahu were to stop as guards, the latter, Tahitian, being selected to remain because of a bad foot which had been brought about by stepping on one of the thorns concealed by the Bushmen. It was evidently a slow poison, and not too strong, that the Bushmen used, for the wounded Punga man was still alive, and though his swollen shoulder was enormous, the inflammation had already begun to go down. He, too, remained with Tudor. Binu Charlie led the way, by proxy, however, for by means of the poisoned spear, he drove the captive Bushman ahead. The runway still ran through the dank and rotten jungle, and they knew no villages would be encountered till rising ground was gained. They plodded on, panting and sweating in the humid, stagnant air. They were immersed in a sea of wanton, prodigal vegetation. All about them, the huge-rooted trees blocked their footing, while coiled and knotted climbers of the girth of a man's arm were thrown from lofty branch to lofty branch, or hung in tangled masses like so many monstrous snakes. Lush-stalked plants, larger-leaved than the body of a man, exuded a sweaty moisture from all their surfaces. Here and there, banyan trees, like rocky islands, shouldered aside the streaming riot of vegetation between their crowded columns, showing portals and passages wherein all daylight was lost and only midnight gloom remained. Tree ferns and mosses and a myriad other parasitic forms jostled with gay-colored fungoid growths for room to live, and the very atmosphere itself seemed to afford clinging space to airy fairy creepers, light and delicate as gem dust, tremulous with microscopic blooms. Pale golden and vermilion orchids flaunted their unhealthy blossoms in the golden dripping sunshine that filtered through the matted roof. It was the mysterious, evil forest, a charnel house of silence, wherein naught moved save strange tiny birds, the strangeness of them making the mystery more profound, for they flitted on noiseless wings, emitting neither song nor chirp, and they were mottled with morbid colours, having all the seeming of orchids, flying blossoms of sickness and decay. He was caught by surprise, 15 feet in the air above the path, in the forks of a many-branched tree. All saw him as he dropped like a shadow, naked as on his natal morn, landing springily on his bent knees, and like a shadow leaping along the runway. It was hard for them to realize that it was a man, for he seemed a weird jungle spirit, a goblin of the forest. Only Binu Charlie was not perturbed. He flung his poisoned spear over the head of the captive at the flitting form. It was a mighty cast, well intended, but the shadow, leaping, received the spear harmlessly between the legs, and tripping upon it, was flung sprawling. Before he could get away, Binu Charlie was upon him, clutching him by his snow-white hair. He was only a young man, and a dandy at that, his face blackened with charcoal, his hair whitened with wood ashes, with the freshly severed tail of a wild pig thrust through his perforated nose, and 2 more thrust through his ears. His only other ornament was a necklace of human finger bones. At sight of their other prisoner, he chattered in a high, querulous falsetto, with puckered brows and troubled, wild animal eyes. He was disposed of along the middle of the line, one of the Punga Punga men leading him at the end of a length of bark rope. The trail began to rise out of the jungle, dipping at times into festering hollows of unwholesome vegetation, but rising more and more over swelling, unseen hill slopes or climbing steep hogbacks and rocky hummocks where the forest thinned and blue patches of sky appeared overhead. Close up he stopped, Binu Charlie warned them in a whisper. Even as he spoke, from high overhead came the deep, resonant boom of a village drum. But the beat was slow. There was no panic in the sound. They were directly beneath the village, and they could hear the crowing of roosters, 2 women's voices raised in brief dispute, and once the crying of a child. The runway now became a deeply worn path, rising so steeply that several times the party paused for breath. The path never widened, and in places the feet and the rains of generations had scoured it till it was sunken 20 feet beneath the surface. 1 man with a rifle could hold it against 1,000, Sheldon whispered to Joan, and 20 men could hold it with spears and arrows. They came out on the village, situated on a small upland plateau, grass-covered and with only occasional trees. There was a wild chorus of warning cries from the women, who scurried out of the grass houses and, like frightened quail, dived over the opposite edge of the clearing, gathering up their babies and children as they ran. At the same time, spears and arrows began to fall among the invaders. At Sheldon's command, the Tahitians and Punga Punga men got into action with their rifles. The spears and arrows ceased, the last bushman disappeared, and the fight was over almost as soon as it had begun. On their own side, no one had been hurt, while 6 bushmen had been killed. These alone remained, the wounded having been carried off. The Tahitians and Punga Punga men had warmed up and were for pursuit, but this Sheldon would not permit. To his pleased surprise, Joan backed him up in the decision. For glancing at her once during the firing, he had seen her white face, like a glittering sword, in its fighting intensity, the nostrils dilated, the eyes bright and steady and shining. "Poor brutes," she said. "They act only according to their natures. To eat their kind and take heads is good morality for them." "But they should be taught not to take white men's heads," Sheldon argued. She nodded approval and said, "If we find one head, we'll burn the village. Hey, you Charlie, what fella place head he stop?" "Suppose he stop along Devil house," was the answer. "That big fella house, he devil. It was the largest house in the village, ambitiously ornamented with fancy plaited mats and king posts carved into obscene and monstrous forms, half human and half animal. Into it they went, in the obscure light, stumbling across the sleeping logs of the village bachelors and knocking their heads against strings of weird votive offerings, dried and shriveled, that hung from the roof beams. On either side were rude gods, some grotesquely carved, others no more than shapeless logs, swathed in rotten and indescribably filthy matting. The air was mouldy and heavy with decay, while strings of fishtails and of half-cleaned dog and crocodile skulls did not add to the wholesomeness of the place. In the center, crouched before a slow, smoking fire, in the littered ashes of 1,000 fires, was an old man who blinked apathetically at the invaders. He was extremely old, so old that his withered skin hung about him in loose folds and did not look like skin. His hands were bony claws, his emaciated face a sheer death's head. His task, it seemed, was to tend the fire, and while he blinked at them, he added to it a handful of dead and mouldy wood, and hung in the smoke they found the object of their search. Joan turned and stumbled out hastily, deathly sick, reeling into the sunshine and clutching at the air for support. "See if all are there," she called back faintly and tottered aimlessly on for a few steps, breathing the air in great draughts and trying to forget the sight she had seen. Upon Sheldon fell the unpleasant task of tallying the heads. They were all there, 9 of them, white men's heads, the faces of which he had been familiar with when their owners had camped in Burandi compound and set up the poling boats. Binu Charlie, hugely interested, lent a hand, turning the heads around for identification, noting the hatchet strokes and remarking the distorted expressions. The Punga Punga men gloated as usual, and as usual the Tahitians were shocked and angry, several of them cursing and muttering in undertones. So angry was Matapu that he strode suddenly over to the fire tender and kicked him in the ribs, whereupon the old savage emitted an appalling squeal, pig-like in its wild animal fear, and fell face downward in the ashes and lay quivering in momentary expectation of death. Other heads, thoroughly sun-dried and smoke-cured, were found in abundance, but with 2 exceptions, they were the heads of blacks. So this was the manner of hunting that went on in the dark and evil forest, Sheldon thought, as he regarded them. The atmosphere of the place was sickening, yet he could not forbear to pause before one of Binu Charlie's finds. "Me savvy Black Mary, me savvy White Mary," quoth Binu Charlie. "Me no savvy that fella Mary. What name belong him?" Sheldon looked, ancient and withered, blackened by many years of the smoke of the Devil house. Nevertheless, the shrunken mummy-like face was unmistakably Chinese. How it had come there was the mystery. It was a woman's head, and he had never heard of a Chinese woman in the history of the Solomons. From the ears hung 2-inch-long earrings, and at Sheldon's direction, the Binu man rubbed away the accretions of smoke and dirt, and from under his fingers appeared the polished green of jade, the sheen of pearl, and the warm red of oriental gold. The other head, equally ancient, was a white man's, as the heavy blonde moustache, twisted and askew on the shriveled upper lip, gave sufficient advertisement, and Sheldon wondered what forgotten beige de mer fisherman or sandalwood trader had gone to furnish that ghastly trophy. Telling Binu Charlie to remove the earrings and directing the Punga Punga men to carry out the old fire tender, Sheldon cleared the Devil house and set fire to it. Soon every house was blazing merrily, while the ancient fire tender sat upright in the sunshine, blinking at the destruction of his village. From the heights above, where were evidently other villages, came the booming of drums and a wild blowing of war conchs. But Sheldon had dared all he cared to with his small following. Besides, his mission was accomplished. Every member of Tudor's expedition was accounted for, and it was a long, dark way out of the headhunters' country. Releasing their 2 prisoners, who leaped away like startled deer, they plunged down the steep path into the steaming jungle. Joan, still shocked by what she had seen, walked on in front of Sheldon, subdued and silent. At the end of half an hour, she turned to him with a wan smile and said, "I don't think I care to visit the headhunters any more. It's adventure, I know, but there is such a thing as having too much of a good thing. Riding around the plantation will henceforth be good enough for me, or perhaps salving another Martha, but the bushmen of Guadalcanar need never worry for fear that I shall visit them again. I shall have nightmares for months to come. I know I shall. Ugh, the horrid beasts." That night found them back in camp with Tudor, who, while improved, would still have to be carried down on a stretcher. The swelling of the Punga Punga man's shoulder was going down slowly, but Arahu still limped on his thorn-poisoned foot. 2 days later, they rejoined the boats at Kali, and at high noon of the 3rd day, traveling with the current and shooting the rapids, the expedition arrived at Barande. Joan, with a sigh, unbuckled her revolver belt and hung it on the nail in the living room, while Sheldon, who had been lurking about for the sheer joy of seeing her perform that particular homecoming act, sighed too, with satisfaction. But the homecoming was not all joy to him, for Joan set about nursing Tudor, and spent much time on the veranda where he lay in the hammock under the mosquito netting. Chapter 26. Burning Daylight. The 10 days of Tudor's convalescence that followed were peaceful days on Barandi. The work of the plantation went on like clockwork. With the crushing of the premature outbreak of Gugumi and his following, all insubordination seemed to have vanished. 20 more of the old-time boys, their term of service up, were carried away by the Martha, and the fresh stock of labor, treated fairly, was proving of excellent quality. As Sheldon rode about the plantation, acknowledging to himself the comfort and convenience of a horse, and wondering why he had not thought of getting one himself, he pondered the various improvements for which Joan was responsible. The splendid Punga Punga recruits, the fruits and vegetables, the Martha herself, snatched from the sea for a song, and earning money hand over fist, despite old Kinross's slow and safe method of running her, and Barande, once more financially secure, approaching each day nearer the dividend-paying time, and growing each day as the black toilers cleared the bush, cut the cane grass, and planted more coconut palms. In these and 1,000 ways, Sheldon was made aware of how much he was indebted for material prosperity to Joan, to the slender, level-browed girl with romance shining out of her grey eyes and adventure shouting from the long-barreled Colts on her hip, who had landed on the beach that piping gale, along with her stalwart Tahitian crew, and who had entered his bungalow to hang with boys' hands her revolver belt and Baden-Powell hat on the nail by the billiard table. He forgot all the early exasperations, remembering only her charms and sweetnesses and glorying much in the traits he at first had disliked most: her boyishness and adventurousness, her delight to swim and risk the sharks, her desire to go recruiting, her love of the sea and ships, her sharp, authoritative words when she launched the whaleboat and, with fire stick in one hand and dynamite stick in the other, departed with her picturesque crew to shoot fish in the Balasuna, her super-innocent disdain for the commonest conventions, her juvenile joy in argument, her fluttering, wild-bird love of freedom, and mad passion for independence. All this he now loved, and he no longer desired to tame and hold her, though the paradox was the winning of her without the taming and the holding. There were times when he was dizzy with thought of her and love of her, when he would stop his horse and with closed eyes picture her as he had seen her that first day in the stern sheets of the whaleboat, dashing madly into shore and marching belligerently along his veranda to remark that it was pretty hospitality, this letting strangers sink or swim in his front yard. And as he opened his eyes and urged his horse onward, he would ponder for the 10,000th time how possibly he was ever to hold her when she was so wild and bird-like that she was bound to flutter out and away from under his hand. It was patent to Sheldon that Tudor had become interested in Joan. That convalescent visitor practically lived on the veranda, though, while preposterously weak and shaky in the legs, he had for some time insisted on coming in to join them at the table at meals. The first warning Sheldon had of the other's growing interest in the girl was when Tudor eased down and finally ceased pricking him with his habitual sharpness of quip and speech. This cessation of verbal sparring was like the breaking off of diplomatic relations between countries at the beginning of war, and once Sheldon's suspicions were aroused, he was not long in finding other confirmations. Tudor, too, obviously joyed in Joan's presence, too obviously laid himself out to amuse and fascinate her with his own glorious and adventurous personality. Often, after his morning ride over the plantation, or coming in from the store, or from inspection of the copra drying, Sheldon found the pair of them together, on the veranda, Joan listening, intent and excited, and Tudor deep in some recital of personal adventure at the ends of the earth. Sheldon noticed, too, the way Tudor looked at her and followed her about with his eyes, and in those eyes he noted a certain hungry look and on the face a certain wistful expression, and he wondered if on his own face he carried a similar involuntary advertisement. He was sure of several things. First, that Tudor was not the right man for Joan and could not possibly make her permanently happy. Next, that Joan was too sensible a girl really to fall in love with a man of such superficial stamp. And finally, that Tudor would blunder his love-making somehow, and at the same time, with true lover's anxiety, Sheldon feared that the other might somehow fail to blunder and win the girl with purely fortuitous and successful meretricious show. But of the one thing Sheldon was sure, Tudor had no intimate knowledge of her and was unaware of how vital in her was her wildness and love of independence. That was where he would blunder, in the catching and the holding of her. And then, in spite of all his certitude, Sheldon could not forbear wondering if his theories of Joan might not be wrong, and if Tudor was not going the right way about after all. The situation was very unsatisfactory and perplexing. Sheldon played the difficult part of waiting and looking on, while his rival devoted himself energetically to reaching out and grasping at the fluttering prize. Then, again, Tudor had such an irritating way about him. It had become quite elusive and intangible now that he had tacitly severed diplomatic relations, but Sheldon sensed what he deemed a growing antagonism and promptly magnified it through the jealous lenses of his own lover's eyes. The other was an interloper. He did not belong to Barandi, and now that he was well and strong again, it was time for him to go. Instead of which, and despite the calling in of the mail steamer bound for Sydney, Tudor had settled himself down comfortably, resumed swimming, went dynamiting fish with Joan, spent hours with her hunting pigeons, trapping crocodiles, and at target practice with rifle and revolver. But there were certain traditions of hospitality that prevented Sheldon from breathing a hint that it was time for his guest to take himself off. And in similar fashion, feeling that it was not playing the game, he fought down the temptation to warn Joan. Had he known anything not too serious to Tudor's detriment, he would have been unable to utter it. But the worst of it was that he knew nothing at all against the man. That was the confounded part of it, and sometimes he was so baffled and overwrought by his feelings that he assumed a superjudicial calm and assured himself that his dislike of Tudor was a matter of unsubstantial prejudice and jealousy. Outwardly, he maintained a calm and smiling aspect. The work of the plantation went on. The Martha and the Flibbertigibbet came and went, as did all the miscellany of coasting craft that dropped in to wait for a breeze and have a gossip, a drink or two, and a game of billiards. Satan kept the compound free of niggers. Boucher came down regularly in his whaleboat to pass Sunday. Twice a day, at breakfast and dinner, Joan and Sheldon and Tudor met amicably at table, and the evenings were as amicably spent on the veranda. And then it happened. Tudor made his blunder, never divining Joan's fluttering wildness, her blind hatred of restraint and compulsion, her abhorrence of mastery by another, and mistaking the warmth and enthusiasm in her eyes, aroused by his latest tale, for something tender and acquiescent, he drew her to him, laid a forcible detaining arm about her waist, and misapprehended her frantic revolt for an exhibition of maidenly reluctance. It occurred on the veranda after breakfast, and Sheldon within, pondering a Sydney wholesaler's catalogue and making up his orders for next steamer day, heard the sharp exclamation of Joan, followed by the equally sharp impact of an open hand against a cheek. Jerking free from the arm that was all distasteful compulsion, Joan had slapped Tudor's face resoundingly, and with far more vim and weight than when she had cuffed Gugumi. Sheldon had half started up, then controlled himself and sunk back in his chair, so that by the time Joan entered the door, his composure was recovered. Her right forearm was clutched tightly in her left hand, while the white cheeks, centered with the spots of flaming red, reminded him of the time he had first seen her angry. "He hurt my arm," she blurted out in reply to his look of inquiry. He smiled involuntarily. It was so like her, so like the boy she was, to come running to complain of the physical hurt which had been done her. She was certainly not a woman versed in the ways of man and in the ways of handling man. The resounding slap she had given Tudor seemed still echoing in Sheldon's ears, and as he looked at the girl before him crying out that her arm was hurt, his smile grew broader. It was the smile that did it, convicting Joan in her own eyes of the silliness of her cry and sending over her face the most amazing blush he had ever seen. Throat, cheeks, and forehead flamed with the rush of the shamed blood. She attempted to vindicate her deeper indignation, then whirled abruptly away and passed out the rear door and down the steps. Sheldon sat and mused. He was a trifle angry, and the more he dwelt upon the happening, the angrier he grew. If it had been any woman except Joan, it would have been amusing. But Joan was the last woman in the world to attempt to kiss forcibly. The thing smacked of the back stairs anyway, a sordid little comedy perhaps, but to have tried it on Joan was nothing less than sacrilege. The man should have had better sense. Then, too, Sheldon was personally aggrieved. He had been filched of something that he felt was almost his, and his lover's jealousy was rampant at thought of this forced familiarity. It was while in this mood that the screen door banged loudly behind the heels of Tudor, who strode into the room and paused before him. Sheldon was unprepared, though it was very apparent that the other was furious. "Well?" Tudor demanded defiantly, and on the instant speech rushed to Sheldon's lips. "I hope you won't attempt anything like it again, that's all, except that I shall be only too happy any time to extend to you the courtesy of my whaleboat. It will land you in Tulagi in a few hours." "As if that would settle it," was the retort. "I don't understand," Sheldon said simply. "Then it is because you don't wish to understand." "Still, I don't understand," Sheldon said, in steady, level tones. "All that is clear to me is that you are exaggerating your own blunder into something serious." Tudor grinned maliciously and replied, "It would seem that you are doing the exaggerating, inviting me to leave in your whaleboat. It is telling me that Miranda is not big enough for the pair of us. Now let me tell you that the Solomon Islands is not big enough for the pair of us. This thing's got to be settled between us, and it may as well be settled right here and now. I can understand your fire-eating manners as being natural to you," Sheldon went on wearily, "but why you should try them on me is what I can't comprehend. You surely don't want to quarrel with me." "I certainly do. But what in heaven's name for?" Tudor surveyed him with withering disgust. "You haven't the soul of a louse. I suppose any man could make love to your wife, but I have no wife," Sheldon interrupted. "Then you ought to have. The situation is outrageous. You might at least marry her, as I am honorably willing to do." For the first time, Sheldon's rising anger boiled over. "You," he began violently, then abruptly caught control of himself and went on soothingly. "You'd better take a drink and think it over. That's my advice to you. Of course, when you do get cool, after talking to me in this fashion, you won't want to stay on any longer. So while you're getting that drink, I'll call the boat's crew and launch a boat. You'll be in Tulagi by 8 this evening." He turned toward the door, as if to put his words into execution, but the other caught him by the shoulder and twirled him around. "Look here, Sheldon, I told you the Solomons were too small for the pair of us, and I meant it." "Is that an offer to buy Barande, lock, stock, and barrel?" Sheldon queried. "No, it isn't. It's an invitation to fight." "But what the devil do you want to fight with me for?" Sheldon's irritation was growing at the other's persistence. "I've no quarrel with you. And what quarrel can you have with me? I have never interfered with you. You were my guest. Miss Lackland is my partner. If you saw fit to make love to her and somehow failed to succeed, why should you want to fight with me? This is the 20th century, my dear fellow, and dueling went out of fashion before you and I were born." "You began the row," Tudor doggedly asserted. "You gave me to understand that it was time for me to go. You fired me out of your house, in short, and then you have the cheek to want to know why I am starting the row. It won't do, I tell you. You started it, and I am going to see it through." Sheldon smiled tolerantly and proceeded to light a cigarette, but Tudor was not to be turned aside. "You started this row," he urged. "There isn't any row. It takes two to make a row, and I, for one, refuse to have anything to do with such tomfoolery." "You started it, I say, and I'll tell you why you started it." "I fancy you've been drinking," Sheldon interposed. It's the only explanation I can find for your unreasonableness. And I'll tell you why you started it. It wasn't silliness on your part to exaggerate this little trifle of lovemaking into something serious. I was poaching on your preserves, and you wanted to get rid of me. It was all very nice and snug here, you and the girl, until I came along, and now you're jealous. That's it, jealousy, and want me out of it. But I won't go. Then stay on by all means. I won't quarrel with you about it. Make yourself comfortable. Stay for a year if you wish. She's not your wife, Tudor continued, as though the other had not spoken. A fellow has the right to make love to her, unless she's your— Well, perhaps it was an error after all, due to ignorance, perfectly excusable on my part. I might have seen it with half an eye if I'd listened to the gossip on the beach. All Gavutu and Tulagi were laughing about it. I was a fool, and I certainly made the mistake of taking the situation on its assumed innocent face value. So angry was Sheldon, becoming that the face and form of the other seemed to vibrate and oscillate before his eyes. Yet outwardly, Sheldon was calm and apparently weary of the discussion. "Please keep her out of the conversation," he said. "But why should I?" was the demand. "The pair of you trapped me into making a fool of myself. How was I to know that everything was not all right? You and she acted as if everything were on the square, but my eyes are open now. Why, she played the outraged wife to perfection, slapped the transgressor and fled to you. Pretty good proof of what all the beach has been saying. Partners, eh? A business partnership? Gammon my eye, that's what it is." Then it was that Sheldon struck out, coolly and deliberately, with all the strength of his arm, and Tudor, caught on the jaw, fell sideways, crumpling as he did so and crushing a chair to kindling wood beneath the weight of his falling body. He pulled himself slowly to his feet, but did not offer to rush. "Now will you fight?" Tudor said grimly. Sheldon laughed, and for the first time, with true spontaneity, the intrinsic ridiculousness of the situation was too much for his sense of humor. He made as if to repeat the blow, but Tudor, white of face, with arms hanging resistlessly at his sides, offered no defense. "I don't mean a fight with fists," he said slowly. "I mean to a finish, to the death. You're a good shot with revolver and rifle. So am I. That's the way we'll settle it." "You have gone clean mad. You are a lunatic." "No, I'm not," Tudor retorted. "I'm a man in love, and once again I ask you to go outside and settle it with any weapons you choose." Sheldon regarded him for the first time with genuine seriousness, wondering what strange maggots could be gnawing in his brain to drive him to such unusual conduct. "But men don't act this way in real life," Sheldon remarked. "You'll find I'm pretty real before you're done with me. I'm going to kill you today." "Bosh and nonsense, man." This time, Sheldon had lost his temper over the superficial aspects of the situation. Bosh and nonsense, that's all it is. Men don't fight duels in the 20th century. It's antediluvian, I tell you. Speaking of Joan— "Please keep her name out of it," Sheldon warned him. "I will, if you'll fight." Sheldon threw up his arms despairingly. "Speaking of Joan—" "Look out," Sheldon warned again. "Oh, go ahead. Knock me down, but that won't close my mouth. You can knock me down all day, but as fast as I get to my feet, I'll speak of Joan again. Now will you fight?" "Listen to me, Tudor," Sheldon began, with an effort at decisiveness. "I am not used to taking from men a tithe of what I've already taken from you." "You'll take a lot more before the day's out," was the answer. "I tell you, you simply must fight. I'll give you a fair chance to kill me, but I'll kill you before the day's out. This isn't civilization. It's the Solomon Islands, and a pretty primitive proposition for all that. King Edward and law and order are represented by the commissioner at Tulagi and an occasional visiting gunboat, and 2 men and 1 woman is an equally primitive proposition. We'll settle it in the good old primitive way. As Sheldon looked at him, the thought came to his mind that after all, there might be something in the other's wild adventures over the earth. It required a man of that caliber, a man capable of obtruding a duel into orderly 20th century life, to find such wild adventures. "There's only one way to stop me," Tudor went on. "I can't insult you directly, I know. You are too easygoing, or cowardly, or both, for that. But I can narrate for you the talk of the beach. Ah, that grinds you, doesn't it? I can tell you what the beach has to say about you and this young girl running a plantation under a business partnership." "Stop!" Sheldon cried, for the other was beginning to vibrate and oscillate before his eyes. "You want a duel. I'll give it to you." Then his common sense and dislike for the ridiculous asserted themselves, and he added, "But it's absurd, impossible. Joan and David, partners, eh? Joan and David, partners." Tudor began to iterate and reiterate in a malicious and scornful chant. "For heaven's sake, keep quiet, and I'll let you have your way," Sheldon cried. "I never saw a fool so bent on his folly. What kind of a duel shall it be? There are no seconds. What weapons shall we use?" Immediately, Tudor's monkey-like impishness left him, and he was once more the cool, self-possessed man of the world. "I've often thought that the ideal duel should be somewhat different from the conventional one," he said. "I've fought several of that sort, you know." "French ones," Sheldon interrupted. "Call them that. But speaking of this ideal duel, here it is. No seconds, of course, and no onlookers. The 2 principals alone are necessary. They may use any weapons they please, from revolvers and rifles to machine guns and pom-poms. They start a mile apart and advance on each other, taking advantage of cover, retreating, circling, feinting, anything and everything permissible. In short, the principals shall hunt each other." "Like a couple of wild Indians?" "Precisely," cried Tudor, delighted. "You've got the idea, and Baranda is just the place, and this is just the right time. Miss Lackland will be taking her siesta, and she'll think we are. We've got 2 hours for it before she wakes, so hurry up and come on. You start out from the Balasuna, and I start from the Baranda. Those 2 rivers are the boundaries of the plantation, aren't they? Very well. The field of the duel will be the plantation. Neither principal must go outside its boundaries. Are you satisfied?" "Quite. But have you any objections if I leave some orders?" "Not at all," Tudor acquiesced, the pink of courtesy now that his wish had been granted. Sheldon clapped his hands, and the running houseboy hurried away to bring back Adamu Adam and Noah. "Listen," Sheldon said to them. "This man and me, we have one big fight today. Maybe he die. Maybe I die. If he die, all right. If I die, you 2 look after Missy Lackalana. You take rifles, and you look after her daytime and nighttime. If she want to talk with Mr. Tudor, all right. If she not want to talk, you make him keep away. Savvy?" They grunted and nodded. They had had much to do with white men, and had learned never to question the strange ways of the strange breed. If these 2 saw fit to go out and kill each other, that was their business, and not the business of the islanders who took orders from them. They stepped to the gun rack, and each picked a rifle. "Better all Tahitian men have rifles," suggested Adamu Adam. "Maybe big trouble come." "All right. You take them," Sheldon answered, busy with issuing the ammunition. They went to the door and down the steps, carrying the 8 rifles to their quarters. Tudor, with cartridge belts for rifle and pistol strapped around him, rifle in hand, stood impatiently waiting. Come on, hurry up. We're burning daylight, he urged, as Sheldon searched after extra clips for his automatic pistol. Together they passed down the steps and out of the compound to the beach, where they turned their backs to each other, and each proceeded toward his destination, their rifles in the hollows of their arms, Tudor walking toward the barandai and Sheldon toward the balisuna. Chapter 27. Modern Dueling. Barely had Sheldon reached the balisuna when he heard the faint report of a distant rifle and knew it was the signal of Tudor, giving notice that he had reached the barandai, turned about, and was coming back. Sheldon fired his rifle into the air in answer, and in turn proceeded to advance. He moved as in a dream, absent-mindedly keeping to the open beach. The thing was so preposterous that he had to struggle to realize it, and he reviewed in his mind the conversation with Tudor, trying to find some clue to the common sense of what he was doing. He did not want to kill Tudor, because that man had blundered in his lovemaking was no reason that he, Sheldon, should take his life. Then what was it all about? True, the fellow had insulted Joan by his subsequent remarks and been knocked down for it, but because he had knocked him down was no reason that he should now try to kill him. In this fashion, he covered a quarter of the distance between the two rivers, when it dawned upon him that Tudor was not on the beach at all. Of course not. He was advancing, according to the terms of the agreement, in the shelter of the coconut trees. Sheldon promptly swerved to the left to seek similar shelter, when the faint crack of a rifle came to his ears, and almost immediately the bullet, striking the hard sand 100 feet beyond him, ricocheted and whined onward on a second flight, convincing him that, preposterous and unreal as it was nevertheless sober fact. It had been intended for him, yet even then it was hard to believe. He glanced over the familiar landscape, and at the sea dimpling in the light but steady breeze. From the direction of Tulagi, he could see the white sails of a schooner laying a tack across toward Barandi. Down the beach, a horse was grazing, and he idly wondered where the others were. The smoke rising from the copra drying caught his eyes, which roved on over the barracks, the tool houses, the boat sheds, and the bungalow, and came to rest on Joan's little grass house in the corner of the compound. Keeping now to the shelter of the trees, he went forward another quarter of a mile. If Tudor had advanced with equal speed, they should have come together at that point, and Sheldon concluded that the other was circling. The difficulty was to locate him. The rows of trees, running at right angles, enabled him to see along only one narrow avenue at a time. His enemy might be coming along the next avenue or the next, to right or left. He might be 100 feet away or half a mile. Sheldon plodded on and decided that the old stereotype duel was far simpler and easier than this protracted hide-and-seek affair. He, too, tried circling in the hope of cutting the other's circle, but without catching a glimpse of him, he finally emerged upon a fresh clearing where the young trees, waist-high, afforded little shelter and less hiding. Just as he emerged, stepping out a pace, a rifle cracked to his right, and though he did not hear the bullet in passing, the thud of it came to his ears when it struck a palm trunk farther on. He sprang back into the protection of the larger trees. Twice he had exposed himself and been fired at, while he had failed to catch a single glimpse of his antagonist. A slow anger began to burn in him. It was deucedly unpleasant, he decided, this being peppered at, and nonsensical as it really was, it was nonetheless deadly serious. There was no avoiding the issue, no firing in the air, and getting over with it as in the old-fashioned duel. This mutual manhunt must keep up until one got the other, and if one neglected a chance to get the other, That increased the other's chance to get him. There could be no false sentiment about it. Tudor had been a cunning devil when he proposed this sort of duel, Sheldon concluded, as he began to work along cautiously in the direction of the last shot. When he arrived at the spot, Tudor was gone, and only his footprints remained, pointing out the course he had taken into the depths of the plantation. Once, 10 minutes later, he caught a glimpse of Tudor, 100 yards away, crossing the same avenue as himself, but going in the opposite direction. His rifle half leaped to his shoulder, but the other was gone. More in whim than in hope of result, grinning to himself as he did so, Sheldon raised his automatic pistol and in 2 seconds sent 8 shots scattering through the trees in the direction in which Tudor had disappeared. Wishing he had a shotgun, Sheldon dropped to the ground behind a tree, slipped a fresh clip up the hollow butt of the pistol, threw a cartridge into the chamber, shoved the safety catch into place, and reloaded the empty clip. It was but a short time after that Tudor tried the same trick on him, the bullets pattering about him like spiteful rain, thudding into the palm trunks or glancing off in whining ricochets. The last bullet of all, making a double ricochet from 2 different trees and losing most of its momentum, struck Sheldon a sharp blow on the forehead and dropped at his feet. He was partly stunned for the moment, but on investigation found no greater harm than a nasty lump that soon rose to the size of a pigeon's egg. The hunt went on. Once, coming to the edge of the grove near the bungalow, he saw the houseboys and the cook clustered on the back veranda and peering curiously among the trees, talking and laughing with one another in their queer falsetto voices. Another time, he came upon a working gang busy at hoeing weeds. They scarcely noticed him when he came up, though they knew thoroughly well what was going on. It was no affair of theirs that the enigmatical white men should be out trying to kill each other, and whatever interest in the proceedings might be theirs, they were careful to conceal it from Sheldon. He ordered them to continue hoeing weeds in a distant and out-of-the-way corner, and went on with the pursuit of Tudor. Tiring of the endless circling, Sheldon tried once more to advance directly on his foe, but the latter was too crafty, taking advantage of his boldness to fire a couple of shots at him and slipping away on some changed and continually changing course. For an hour, they dodged and turned and twisted back and forth and around and hunted each other among the orderly palms. They caught fleeting glimpses of each other and chanced flying shots, which were without result. On a grassy shelter behind a tree, Sheldon came upon where Tudor had rested and smoked a cigarette. The pressed grass showed where he had sat. To one side lay the cigarette stump and the charred match which had lighted it. In front lay a scattering of bright metallic fragments. Sheldon recognized their significance. Tudor was notching his steel-jacketed bullets or cutting them blunt so that they would spread on striking. In short, he was making them into the vicious dum-dum prohibited in modern warfare. Sheldon knew now what would happen to him if a bullet struck his body. It would leave a tiny hole where it entered, but the hole where it emerged would be the size of a saucer. He decided to give up the pursuit and lay down in the grass, protected right and left by the row of palms, with on either hand the long avenue extending. This he could watch. Tudor would have to come to him, or else there would be no termination of the affair. He wiped the sweat from his face and tied the handkerchief around his neck to keep off the stinging gnats that lurked in the grass. Never had he felt so great a disgust for the thing called adventure. Joan had been bad enough with her Baden Powell and long-barreled Colts, But here was this newcomer, also looking for adventure, and finding it in no other way than by lugging a peace-loving planter into an absurd and preposterous bushwhacking duel. If ever adventure was well damned, it was by Sheldon, sweating in the windless grass and fighting gnats, the while he kept close watch up and down the avenue. Then Tudor came. Sheldon happened to be looking in his direction at the moment he came into view, peering quickly up and down the avenue before he stepped into the open. Midway he stopped, as if debating what course to pursue. He made a splendid mark, facing his concealed enemy at 200 yards distance. Sheldon aimed at the center of his chest, then deliberately shifted the aim to his right shoulder, and with the thought, "That will put him out of business," pulled the trigger. The bullet, driving with momentum, sufficient to perforate a man's body a mile distant, struck Tudor with such force as to pivot him, whirling him half around by the shock of its impact and knocking him down. "Hope I haven't killed the beggar," Sheldon muttered aloud, springing to his feet and running forward. 100 feet away, all anxiety on that score was relieved by Tudor, who made shift with his left hand, and from his automatic pistol hurled a rain of bullets all around Sheldon. The latter dodged behind a palm trunk, counting the shots, and when the 8th had been fired, he rushed in on the wounded man. He kicked the pistol out of the other's hand and then sat down on him in order to keep him down. "Be quiet," he said. "I've got you, so there's no use struggling." Tudor still attempted to struggle and to throw him off. "Keep quiet, I tell you," Sheldon commanded. "I'm satisfied with the outcome, and you've got to be, so you might as well give in and call this affair closed." Tudor reluctantly relaxed. "Rather funny, isn't it, these modern duels?" Sheldon grinned down at him as he removed his weight. "Not a bit dignified. If you'd struggled a moment longer, I'd have rubbed your face in the earth. I've a good mind to do it anyway, just to teach you that dueling has gone out of fashion. Now, let us see to your injuries." "You only got me that last," Tudor grunted sullenly. "Lying in ambush like a wild Indian. Precisely. You've caught the idea, old man." Sheldon ceased his mocking and stood up. "You lie there quietly until I send back some of the boys to carry you in. You're not seriously hurt, and it's lucky for you I didn't follow your example. If you had been struck with one of your own bullets, a carriage and pair would have been none too large to drive through the hole it would have made. As it is, you're drilled clean. A nice little perforation. All you need is antiseptic washing and dressing, and you'll be around in a month. Now take it easy, and I'll send a stretcher for you." Chapter 28. Capitulation. When Sheldon emerged from among the trees, he found Joan waiting at the compound gate, and he could not fail to see that she was visibly gladdened at the sight of him. "I can't tell you how glad I am to see you," was her greeting. "What's become of Tudor? That last flutter of the automatic wasn't nice to listen to. Was it you or Tudor?" "So you know all about it," he answered coolly. "Well, it was Tudor, but he was doing it left-handed. He's down with a hole in his shoulder." He looked at her keenly. "Disappointing, isn't it?" he drawled. "How do you mean?" "Why, that I didn't kill him." "But I didn't want him killed just because he kissed me," she cried. "Oh, he did kiss you," Sheldon retorted, in evident surprise. "I thought you said he hurt your arm." "One could call it a kiss, though it was only on the end of the nose." She laughed at the recollection. "But I paid him back for that myself. I boxed his face for him, and he did hurt my arm. It's black and blue. Look at it." She pulled up the loose sleeve of her blouse, and he saw the bruised imprints of 2 fingers. Just then, a gang of blacks came out from among the trees, carrying the wounded man on a rough stretcher. "Romantic, isn't it?" Sheldon sneered, following Joan's startled gaze. "And now I'll have to play surgeon and doctor him up. Funny, this 20th century dueling. First you drill a hole in a man, and next you set about plugging the hole up." They had stepped aside to let the stretcher pass, and Tudor, who had heard the remark, lifted himself up on the elbow of his sound arm and said with a defiant grin, "If you'd got one of mine, you'd have had to plug with a dinner plate." "Oh, you wretch!" Joan cried. "You've been cutting your bullets." "It was according to agreement," Tudor answered. "Everything went. We could have used dynamite if we wanted to." "He's right," Sheldon assured her as they swung in behind. "Any weapon was permissible. I lay in the grass where he couldn't see me and bushwhacked him in truly noble fashion. That's what comes of having women on the plantation. And now it's antiseptics and drainage tubes, I suppose. It's a nasty mess, and I'll have to read up on it before I tackle the job." "I don't see that it's my fault," she began. "I couldn't help it because he kissed me. I never dreamed he would attempt it." "We didn't fight for that reason. But there isn't time to explain. If you'll get dressings and bandages ready, I'll look up gunshot wounds and see what's to be done." "Is he bleeding seriously?" she asked. "No. The bullet seems to have missed the important arteries. But that would have been a pickle." "Then there's no need to bother about reading up," Joan said. "And I'm just dying to hear what it was all about. The Apostle is lying becalmed inside the point, and her boats are out to wing. She'll be at anchor in 5 minutes, and Dr. Welshmere is sure to be on board. So all we've got to do is to make Tudor comfortable. We'd better put him in your room under the mosquito netting and send a boat off to tell Dr. Welshmere to bring his instruments." An hour afterward, Dr. Welshmere left the patient comfortable and attended to, and went down to the beach to go on board, promising to come back to dinner. Joan and Sheldon, standing on the veranda, watched him depart. "I'll never have it in for the missionaries again since seeing them here in the Solomons," she said, seating herself in a steamer chair. She looked at Sheldon and began to laugh. "That's right," he said. "It's the way I feel, playing the fool and trying to murder a guest." "But you haven't told me what it was all about." "You," he answered shortly. "Me? But you just said it wasn't." "Oh, it wasn't the kiss." He walked over to the railing and leaned against it, facing her. "But it was about you all the same, and I may as well tell you. You remember, I warned you long ago what would happen when you wanted to become a partner in Barandi. Well, all the beach is gossiping about it, and Tudor persisted in repeating the gossip to me. So you see, it won't do for you to stay on here under present conditions. It would be better if you went away." "But I don't want to go away," she objected with rueful countenance. "A chaperone, then?" "No, nor a chaperone. But you surely don't expect me to go around shooting every slanderer in the Solomons that opens his mouth," he demanded gloomily. "No, nor that either," she answered with quick impulsiveness. "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get married and put a stop to it all. There." He looked at her in amazement and would have believed that she was making fun of him had it not been for the warm blood that suddenly suffused her cheeks. "Do you mean that?" he asked unsteadily. "Why?" "To put a stop to all the nasty gossip of the beach. That's a pretty good reason, isn't it?" The temptation was strong enough and sudden enough to make him waver, but all the disgust came back to him that was his when he lay in the grass, fighting gnats and cursing adventure, and he answered, "No, it is worse than no reason at all. I don't care to marry you as a matter of expedience." "You are the most ridiculous creature," she broke in, with a flash of her old-time anger. "You talk love and marriage to me, very much against my wish, and go mooning around over the plantation week after week because you can't have me. And look at me when you think I'm not noticing, and when all the time I'm wondering when you had your last square meal because of the hungry look in your eyes, and make eyes at my revolver, belt hanging on a nail, and fight duels about me and all the rest, and now when I say I'll marry you, you do yourself the honor of refusing me." "You can't make me any more ridiculous than I feel," he answered, rubbing the lump on his forehead reflectively. "And if this is the accepted romantic program, a duel over a girl, and the girl rushing into the arms of the winner, why, I shall not make a bigger ass of myself by going in for it." "I thought you'd jump at it," she confessed, with a naivete he could not but question, for he thought he saw a roguish gleam in her eyes. "My conception of love must differ from yours then," he said. "I should want a woman to marry me for love of me, and not out of romantic admiration, because I was lucky enough to drill a hole in a man's shoulder with smokeless powder. I tell you I am disgusted with this adventure, tomfoolery, and rot. I don't like it. Tudor is a sample of the adventure kind, picking a quarrel with me and behaving like a monkey, insisting on fighting with me. To the death," he said. It was like a penny dreadful. She was biting her lip, and though her eyes were cool and level-looking as ever, the telltale, angry red was in her cheeks. "Of course, if you don't want to marry me, but I do," he hastily interposed. "Oh, you do. But don't you see, little girl, I want you to love me," he hurried on. "Otherwise, it would be only half a marriage. I don't want you to marry me simply because by so doing a stop is put to the beach gossip, nor do I want you to marry me out of some foolish romantic notion. I shouldn't want you that way." "Oh, in that case," she said, with assumed deliberateness, and he could have sworn to the roguish gleam, "in that case, since you are willing to consider my offer, let me make a few remarks. In the first place, you needn't sneer at adventure when you are living it yourself, and you were certainly living it when I found you first, down with fever on a lonely plantation with a couple of hundred wild cannibals thirsting for your life. Then I came along, and what with your arriving in a gale," he broke in, "fresh from the wreck of the schooner, landing on the beach in a whaleboat full of picturesque Tahitian sailors, and coming into the bungalow with a Baden Powell on your head, sea boots on your feet, and a whacking big Colts dangling on your hip. Why, I am only too ready to admit that you were the quintessence of adventure." "Very good," she cried exultantly. "It's mere simple arithmetic, the adding of your adventure and my adventure together. So that's settled, and you needn't jeer at adventure any more. Next, I don't think there was anything romantic in Tudor's attempting to kiss me, nor anything like adventure in this absurd duel. But I do think now that it was romantic for you to fall in love with me. And finally, and it is adding romance to romance, I think I do love you, Dave. Oh, Dave." The last was a sighing dove cry as he caught her up in his arms and pressed her to him. "But I don't love you because you played the fool today," she whispered on his shoulder. "White men shouldn't go around killing each other." "Then why do you love me?" he questioned, enthralled after the manner of all lovers in the everlasting query that forever has remained unanswered. "I don't know. Just because I do, I guess. And that's all the satisfaction you gave me when we had that man talk. But I have been loving you for weeks. During all the time, you have been so deliciously and unobtrusively jealous of Tudor." "Yes, yes, go on," he urged breathlessly, when she paused. "I wondered when you'd break out, and because you didn't, I loved you all the more. You were like Dad and Von. You could hold yourself in check. You didn't make a fool of yourself. Not until today, he suggested. Yes, and I loved you for that too. It was about time. I began to think you were never going to bring up the subject again, and now that I have offered myself, you haven't even accepted. With both hands on her shoulders, he held her at arm's length from him and looked long into her eyes, no longer cool, but seemingly pervaded with a golden flush. The lids drooped, and yet bravely did not droop, as she returned his gaze. Then he fondly and solemnly drew her to him. "And how about that hearth and saddle of your own?" he asked a moment later. "I well nigh won to them. The grass house is my hearth, and the Martha my saddle, and look at all the trees I've planted, to say nothing of the sweet corn, and it's all your fault anyway. I might never have loved you if you hadn't put the idea into my head." "There's the non-Gassler coming in around the point with her boats out," Sheldon remarked irrelevantly. "And the commissioner is on board. He's going down to San Cristobal to investigate that missionary killing. We're in luck, I must say." "I don't see where the luck comes in," she said dolefully. "We ought to have this evening all to ourselves just to talk things over. I've 1,000 questions to ask you." "And it wouldn't have been a man talk either," she added. "But my plan is better than that." He debated with himself a moment. "You see, the commissioner is the one official in the islands who can give us a license. And there's the luck of it. Dr. Welshmere is here to perform the ceremony. We'll get married this evening." Joan recoiled from him in panic, tearing herself from his arms and going backward several steps. He could see that she was really frightened. I thought," she stammered. Then, slowly, the change came over her, and the blood flooded into her face in the same amazing blush he had seen once before that day. Her cool, level-looking eyes were no longer level-looking nor cool, but warmly drooping and just unable to meet his, as she came toward him and nestled in the circle of his arms, saying softly, almost in a whisper, "I am ready, Dave.